Welcome, fellow dreamer. You have found a place of calm and rest. This evening, we're going to explore the remarkable story of railways, where mighty steam engines and gleaming iron tracks transformed our world forever. We'll journey through the age when these mechanical marvels began connecting distant cities, shrinking vast continents, and weaving together the fabric of modern civilization. Accompanied by soothing music and abstract imagery, we'll be uncovering little-known wonders and fascinating stories that gently feed your curiosity as you drift towards sleep. If you enjoy these calm adventures with us, don't be shy. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment to help other smart sleepers dream too. And now, take a deep breath, let your body sink into comfort, and allow your mind to rest and your eyes to close as the tale unfolds before you. Before the coming of the railway, the world moved at the pace of a walking horse, and distance was measured not in miles but in days. A journey that seems routine today, a trip across a country or between distant cities, was once an expedition requiring careful planning, considerable expense, and no small amount of courage. To understand the revolution that railways would bring, we must first step back into that slower, more isolated world, where the rhythm of travel had changed little since ancient times. In the early decades of the 19th century, most roads connecting towns and villages were little more than rutted dirt tracks that turned to mud in rain and froze into treacherous ridges in winter. These thoroughfares had been carved by centuries of use, following contours that minimized steep climbs and sought out natural fording places at rivers. During dry summer months, they might offer reasonable passage, but spring thaws transformed them into quagmires that could trap a wagon to its axles. Travelers spoke of roads so poor that coaches had to be pulled out by teams of oxen, and of journeys delayed for days while waiting for conditions to improve. The vehicles that traveled these roads were horse-drawn coaches, wagons, and carts, their designs refined over generations but fundamentally unchanged in concept. A stagecoach traveling between major cities might average 5 or 6 miles per hour under good conditions, stopping frequently to change horses at coaching inns spaced along the route. The animals could only maintain their pace for a limited time before exhaustion set in, and even with fresh teams waiting at intervals, a journey of 100 miles represented a full day of bone-jarring travel, often stretching into a second day. For those who could not afford coach fare, walking remained the primary means of travel, as it had been for countless generations. Farm workers might trudge 10 or 15 miles to market and back in a single day. Itinerant labourers walked from one region to another in search of seasonal work, carrying their possessions on their backs. News travelled at this same walking pace, carried by foot messengers or riders on horseback, meaning that events in a distant county might not be known for days or even weeks. The cost of moving goods constrained trade and commerce in ways difficult to imagine today. Heavy or bulky items became prohibitively expensive to transport overland any significant distance. A wagon drawn by a team of horses could haul perhaps a ton of cargo, and the expense of feeding the animals, paying the driver, and maintaining the vehicle meant that only valuable goods justified long-distance road transport. Coal, iron, grain, and other bulk commodities could rarely be moved more than a few miles from their source unless water transport was available. Rivers and canals offered an alternative where geography permitted. Boats and barges could carry far heavier loads than any wagon, pulled along by horses walking towpaths beside the water. The 18th century had seen a great expansion of canal building in Britain and other industrializing nations, creating artificial waterways to connect mining regions with manufacturing centers and ports. A single barge horse could pull a boat carrying 30 tons or more, gliding along at a leisurely walking pace. Yet canals had their limitations. They required enormous investment to construct, could only be built where terrain and water supply permitted, and they froze solid in harsh winters, bringing commerce to a complete halt. This patchwork system of roads, rivers, and canals meant that communities remained largely isolated from one another. A village might exist just 20 miles from a major city, yet its inhabitants could live their entire lives with only occasional ventures beyond familiar boundaries. Local dialects, customs, and ways of life persisted in remarkable variety across relatively small areas because people, ideas, and influences moved so slowly. Markets remained intensely local, farmers sold their produce within a radius of a few miles, craftsmen served nearby customers, and most goods were produced close to where they would be consumed. The pace of life synchronized itself to these constraints. Businesses operated on timescales that accommodated the slow movement of information and goods. Orders placed with distant suppliers might take weeks to arrive. Letters sent to correspondents in other regions required patience, a response might not come for many days, and urgent matters could not be resolved quickly across distance. This temporal rhythm seemed natural and unchangeable, the inevitable consequence of the physical limitations of human and animal power. For industries emerging during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, these transportation constraints posed significant challenges. New factories driven by water power or steam engines could produce goods in unprecedented quantities, but what use was mass production if products could not reach distant markets? Iron foundries and coal mines might operate side by side with vast demand in cities and towns, yet the cost of moving heavy materials limited their potential. Inventors and engineers were creating remarkable new machines and manufacturing processes, but the ancient system of roads and horse-drawn transport created a bottleneck that constrained economic growth. Weather governed travel with absolute authority. Winter journeys were scheduled with trepidation, knowing that snow could close roads entirely or make them passable only with the greatest difficulty. Spring flooding turned rivers into barriers and roads into streams. Autumn rains extended journey times unpredictably. Travelers learned to build extra days into their plans, accepting that arrival times were approximate at best. The very notion of a fixed timetable seemed almost absurd when so many variables could delay or reroute a journey. In this world of muddy roads and slow wagons, of frozen canals and isolated villages, people dreamed of better ways to move. Engineers and inventors had already begun experimenting with mechanical solutions, creating stationary steam engines for pumping water and powering machinery. Wooden rails had appeared in mines, allowing horses to pull heavier loads in small wagons. Yet few could envision how these separate developments might combine to create something entirely new, a technology that would shrink distances, accelerate commerce, and fundamentally transform how human beings related to space and time. The stage was set for transformation. The Industrial Revolution had created both the technical knowledge and the economic necessity for a new form of transport. What was needed was a synthesis of existing technologies, the vision to imagine something that had never existed before, and the determination to overcome the countless obstacles that would stand in the way. That synthesis would emerge from a series of innovations and experiments with tracks, wheels, and steam power, developments whose origins stretched back centuries before anyone imagined a locomotive thundering across the countryside. The story of railways begins not with the thunderous roar of steam locomotives or the gleaming rails of the 19th century, but in the quiet whisper of ancient stone, worn smooth by countless wheels rolling along the same path, year after year, century after century. Long before anyone dreamed of harnessing steam power, civilizations discovered a fundamental truth: moving heavy loads becomes easier when wheels follow a defined path. In the limestone quarries of ancient Greece, workers carved grooves into the rock itself, creating parallel channels that guided wheeled carts along predetermined routes. These stone trackways, some dating back to the 6th century before the Common Era, represented humanity's first recognition that controlling the path of a vehicle could multiply the efficiency of transport. The ancient Greeks called these grooved pathways diolkos, and the most famous example ran across the Isthmus of Corinth, that narrow neck of land connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. Here, rather than sailing the long and dangerous route around the peninsula, ships and their cargoes could be transferred to wheeled platforms that rolled along stone grooves spanning nearly 4 miles. The channels, cut precisely to match the wheel spacing of their carts, guided vessels and goods across land with remarkable efficiency. These grooves still exist today, testament to an insight that would echo through millennia. The Roman Empire, with its genius for engineering and its insatiable appetite for building projects, understood this principle well. Throughout their vast territories, Roman engineers sometimes incorporated grooved tracks into their infrastructure, particularly in mining operations and at construction sites where heavy stones needed moving repeatedly along the same routes. While the famous Roman roads carried most traffic on their cambered surfaces, these specialized grooved ways represented early experiments in guided transport. Yet these ancient trackways differed fundamentally from what we would later call railways. The grooves guided wheels, yes, but the vehicles themselves provided no mechanical advantage. They were simply roads with grooves, not rails with wheels designed specifically to run upon them. The transformation from grooved road to raised rail would take many centuries and require a very particular set of circumstances to emerge. Those circumstances arose in the mines of medieval Europe. Deep underground, where miners hauled heavy loads of ore and coal through narrow tunnels, every innovation that reduced effort became precious. By the 14th and 15th centuries, mining operations in the Harz Mountains of Germany and in various locations across Central Europe began experimenting with a different approach. Instead of grooves cut into the ground, they laid wooden rails, simple planks or logs, along which carts with flanged wheels could roll. This represented a conceptual revolution. Rather than containing the wheels with grooves, these systems elevated the track and designed wheels to stay upon it. The wooden rails, running parallel like two ribbons through the darkness of mine tunnels, provided a smoother surface than rough tunnel floors. Carts rolled more easily, and miners could haul heavier loads with less exhausting effort. By the 16th century, these wooden railways, or wagonways as they came to be called, began emerging above ground as well. In the mining regions of Transylvania and the Germanic states, wooden rail systems transported ore from mine entrances to smelting facilities. The rails typically consisted of thick wooden planks, sometimes with a guiding pin between them to keep wheels on course. In other designs, the wheels themselves had flanges, projecting rims that gripped the rail and prevented the cart from wandering off its path. England, with its growing appetite for coal to fuel domestic hearths and early industries, embraced the wagonway concept with particular enthusiasm. By the early 17th century, wooden rail systems began spreading across the coalfields of northeastern England, particularly around Newcastle upon Tyne. These wagonways ran from coal pits to riverside wharves where the coal could be loaded onto ships bound for London and other markets. The English wagonways grew increasingly sophisticated. Mine owners invested substantial sums in constructing these wooden railways, which could stretch for several miles across the countryside. A horse, pulling a cart on wooden rails, could haul several times the load it could manage on an ordinary road. This simple fact made the investment worthwhile. The wood, usually oak for durability, required constant maintenance and regular replacement as rails wore down under the grinding passage of iron-rimmed wheels, but the economic advantages justified the expense. Walking along one of these 17th-century wagonways would have been an oddly familiar yet strange experience for a modern observer. The basic concept, parallel rails supporting wheeled vehicles, would be immediately recognizable. Yet everything else would seem peculiarly primitive. The rails themselves, rough-hewn wooden beams spiked to wooden crosspieces called sleepers, would appear crude compared to later iron and steel construction. The carts, simple wooden boxes on 4 wheels, bore no resemblance to the elegant carriages and powerful locomotives that would eventually run on rails. The rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves provided the only sound and power. A single horse, leaning into its harness, might pull a train of several linked carts loaded with coal, the wheels creaking as they rolled along the wooden rails. In wet weather, the wood became slippery and treacherous. In dry summer heat, rails could crack and split. Winter brought its own challenges as ice formed on the rails and snow obscured the track. Despite these limitations, the wagonway proved its worth. By the early 18th century, hundreds of miles of wooden railways crisscrossed the mining districts of Britain and parts of continental Europe. Some included sophisticated features like passing loops where wagons traveling in opposite directions could meet, and even primitive points or switches where tracks diverged, allowing wagons to be directed onto different routes. The vulnerability of wooden rails led to gradual experimentation with more durable materials. Some operators began capping their wooden rails with thin strips of iron, protecting the wood from wear and providing a smoother surface for wheels to roll upon. Others experimented with rails made entirely of cast iron, though the brittle nature of early iron casting limited these early attempts. These humble wooden wagonways, creaking through the countryside behind patient horses, contained within them the seed of transformation. The fundamental principle had been established: vehicles designed to run on dedicated rails could move heavier loads more efficiently than any road-based transport. All that remained was to find a new source of power to replace the horses, and to develop rails strong enough to support the weight and force that such power would demand. In the flickering lamplight of mine tunnels and across the rolling hills of the coalfields, the future was taking shape, slowly and quietly, one wooden rail at a time. The wooden rails and horse-drawn wagons had served their purpose well, moving coal and ore from mines to rivers and canals across Britain and Europe. Yet by the middle of the 18th century, a different kind of power was beginning to stir in the depths of those same mines, a power that would eventually transform those simple trackways into something far more revolutionary. Deep beneath the surface of England, in the coal mines of the Midlands and the tin mines of Cornwall, water was the enemy. As miners dug deeper in search of valuable minerals, groundwater would seep and flood the shafts, making further excavation impossible. For generations, this water had been removed by teams of horses turning wheels connected to pumps, or by human labor carrying buckets up endless ladders. The work was exhausting, expensive, and limited how deep anyone could safely dig. In 1712, a man named Thomas Newcomen, an ironmonger from Dartmouth in Devon, developed a machine that would begin to change everything. His atmospheric engine was a remarkable device that used the power of steam in a clever way. Steam would fill a large cylinder, and then cold water would be sprayed inside, causing the steam to condense rapidly. This created a partial vacuum, and the pressure of the outside air would push a piston down into that vacuum. Connected to a rocking beam, this motion could drive a pump that lifted water from the mine depths. The Newcomen engine was not elegant by any measure. It consumed enormous quantities of coal to produce its steam, and it worked slowly, with a rhythmic back-and-forth motion that could be heard from a considerable distance. Yet for all its inefficiency, it worked. Through the decades that followed, hundreds of these engines were installed in mines across Britain and Europe, faithfully pumping water day and night, allowing miners to venture ever deeper into the earth. The age of steam power had begun, though it remained tethered to one spot, a stationary giant doing its patient work. For more than 50 years, the Newcomen engine represented the height of steam technology. Then, in the 1760s, a young Scottish instrument maker named James Watt was given a model of a Newcomen engine to repair at the University of Glasgow. As he worked on the device, Watt began to understand its fundamental inefficiency. The cylinder had to be heated when steam entered, then cooled when cold water was sprayed inside, then heated again for the next cycle. This constant heating and cooling wasted tremendous amounts of energy. Watt's crucial insight was beautifully simple. What if the steam condensed in a separate chamber, keeping the main cylinder always hot? This idea, which came to him during a walk on a spring afternoon in 1765, would transform the steam engine from a crude pump into a sophisticated machine. Yet understanding what needed to be done and actually building it proved to be two very different challenges. Watt spent years developing his ideas, struggling with the practical difficulties of making cylinders smooth enough and pistons tight enough to maintain the necessary seal. In the 1770s, Watt entered into partnership with Matthew Boulton, a wealthy manufacturer from Birmingham who had the resources and business acumen that Watt lacked. Together, they began producing improved steam engines at Boulton's Soho works. Watt's engines used roughly 3/4 less coal than the old Newcomen designs, making them far more economical. The savings in fuel costs alone could pay for the new engine within a few years. But Watt didn't stop with the separate condenser. Through the 1780s, he introduced a series of refinements that made the steam engine not just a pump, but a source of rotary motion that could power all manner of machinery. He developed a sun and planet gear system that converted the engine's back and forth motion into circular rotation. He designed a governor, an elegant device with spinning balls that automatically regulated the engine's speed. He introduced a double-acting cylinder where steam pushed the piston both up and down, doubling the power output. These improvements transformed what industry could accomplish. Watt's engines began to power textile mills, flour mills, iron works, and manufactories of every description. No longer did factories need to be built beside fast-flowing streams to harness water power. Now they could be located wherever was most convenient for receiving raw materials and shipping finished goods. The steam engine became the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution, driving countless machines with its steady, powerful rhythm. Yet for all these advances, the steam engines of Newcomen, Watt, and their contemporaries remained stationary. They were bolted to foundations, connected to pumps or machinery by beams and belts. They were powerful, increasingly efficient, and utterly immobile. The idea that such an engine might somehow move itself, carrying loads across the countryside on iron rails, seemed far-fetched to most practical engineers of the era. James Watt himself was skeptical of putting steam engines on wheels. He had worked so hard to make his engines efficient and reliable. The thought of sending them bouncing down rough tracks, subject to jolts and vibrations, seemed likely to break these precision machines apart. His patents, which he defended vigorously, may have also discouraged others from experimenting too freely with mobile applications of steam power. Yet the dream persisted in some minds. If a steam engine could pump water from a mine or turn the spindles in a textile mill, might it not also pull wagons along those wooden rails that now crossed the mining districts? The elements were all present, waiting to be combined. The rails were there, growing stronger as iron replaced wood. The steam engine was there, growing more compact and powerful with each refinement. What was needed was someone bold enough, or perhaps stubborn enough, to bring these elements together. As the 18th century drew to a close, that person was preparing to step onto history's stage. In the rugged mining districts of Cornwall, where engines pumped water from deep tin mines and where innovation was driven by necessity rather than theory, a young engineer was beginning to imagine something that had never existed before. The stationary age of steam was about to give way to the mobile age, though few could yet imagine what that transformation would mean. The stationary steam engines that James Watt had perfected continued to pump water from mines and power mills throughout Britain as the 18th century drew to a close. These magnificent machines remained firmly anchored to their foundations, connected by beams and pistons to the pumps and machinery they served. Yet in the mind of one inventive Cornish engineer, a revolutionary question was forming: what if such an engine could move itself? Richard Trevithick was born in 1771 in the mining district of Cornwall, where steam engines were as common as the tin and copper mines they served. Growing up among the rhythmic hiss and clank of Watt's engines, young Richard developed an intuitive understanding of steam power. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall, known for his physical strength and his willingness to test his inventions personally. Where others saw the limitations of existing steam technology, Trevithick saw possibilities. The key insight that set Trevithick apart from his contemporaries was his recognition that steam could be used at much higher pressures than Watt's engines employed. Watt's designs operated at just above atmospheric pressure, requiring large, heavy cylinders and condensers. Trevithick realized that if he could safely contain steam at higher pressures, he could build a much smaller, lighter engine that still produced considerable power. This was essential if a steam engine was ever going to move under its own power, whether on roads or rails. By 1801, Trevithick had built a steam-powered road carriage that successfully carried passengers through the streets of his hometown of Camborne on Christmas Eve. The locals called it the Puffing Devil, watching in amazement as it climbed a hill with several men aboard, steam billowing from its chimney. This demonstration proved that a self-propelled steam vehicle was indeed possible, though the experiment ended a few days later when the machine was damaged by fire while the crew celebrated at a nearby inn. But Trevithick's ambitions extended beyond road carriages. He recognized that the smooth surface of iron rails offered significant advantages over the rutted, uneven roads of the era. Rails would reduce friction and provide a stable path for a steam locomotive. The question that many engineers of the time debated was whether iron wheels on iron rails could provide sufficient grip to pull a load. Some believed the wheels would simply spin uselessly, unable to gain traction on the smooth metal surface. In 1804, Trevithick had his opportunity to prove the skeptics wrong. Samuel Homfray, owner of the Penydarren Ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, made a wager with another iron master named Richard Crawshay. Homfray bet 500 guineas, a substantial sum, that Trevithick's steam locomotive could haul 10 tons of iron along the tramway that connected his ironworks to the canal at Abercynon, a distance of nearly 10 miles. Crawshay accepted the bet, confident that such a feat was impossible. On February 21, 1804, Trevithick's locomotive made its historic journey. The engine itself was a marvel of compact design, with a single horizontal cylinder driving the wheels through a system of gears. A large flywheel helped maintain smooth motion, and the exhaust steam was directed up the chimney to increase the draft on the fire, making the boiler more efficient. This last innovation would prove particularly important in future locomotive design. The locomotive successfully hauled not just the 10 tons of iron specified in the wager, but also 5 additional wagons loaded with 70 men who had come along to witness this extraordinary event. The journey took just over 4 hours, with the engine traveling at about 5 miles per hour along the tramway. Crowds gathered along the route to watch this mechanical wonder pass by, some amazed, others skeptical, but all aware they were witnessing something unprecedented. Trevithick had won the bet for Homfray, demonstrating conclusively that iron wheels could grip iron rails sufficiently to pull heavy loads. The journey proved that steam locomotives were technically feasible. Yet despite this triumph, the immediate practical impact was disappointingly limited. The fundamental problem lay not with the locomotive itself, but with the infrastructure it ran upon. The tramways of the era were built with brittle cast iron rails designed to support horse-drawn wagons weighing perhaps a ton or two. Trevithick's locomotive, loaded with water and fuel, weighed nearly 5 tons, and when pulling a heavy load, it exerted forces the rails simply could not withstand. The rails kept breaking beneath the engine's weight, making regular operation impractical. Repairing and replacing broken rails proved more expensive than simply continuing to use horses. Trevithick built several more locomotives over the following years, experimenting with different designs and demonstrating them in various locations. In 1808, he constructed a circular demonstration track in London near what is now Euston Station, charging spectators £1 to ride behind his latest engine, which he called Catch Me Who Can. Londoners marveled at this mechanical curiosity, riding in circles at 12 miles per hour, faster than any horse-drawn vehicle they had experienced. Yet these demonstrations remained novelties rather than practical transportation systems. Trevithick lacked the business acumen and persistence to develop his inventions into commercial success. He was an engineer at heart, more interested in solving technical problems than in the patient work of building a business. Eventually, he abandoned locomotives altogether, pursuing other inventions and engineering projects, including a disastrous mining venture in South America from which he would barely return alive. Richard Trevithick died in poverty in 1833, his pioneering achievements largely unrecognized by the public that would soon embrace railways with such enthusiasm. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Dartford, Kent. The world had not quite been ready for his vision in 1804, but he had proven what was possible. The locomotive dream he had brought to life would need another generation of engineers to refine the technology and, crucially, to develop rails strong enough to support it. The problems Trevithick encountered would require solutions in metallurgy, engineering, and infrastructure before steam locomotives could fulfill their potential. But the fundamental principle had been established. A steam engine could move itself and pull a useful load along iron rails. The seed had been planted, awaiting the right conditions to grow into the railway revolution that would transform the world. The morning of September 27, 1825, dawned with anticipation across the northeast of England. After years of planning, surveying, and construction, the Stockton and Darlington Railway was about to open to the public. Crowds had gathered along the route, curious to witness this new venture that promised to revolutionize the movement of coal from the Durham coalfields to the port at Stockton-on-Tees. The air hummed with excitement and skepticism in equal measure, for while Richard Trevithick had demonstrated that steam locomotives could work 2 decades earlier, no one had yet proven they could operate reliably as part of a commercial railway serving the public. At the heart of this enterprise stood George Stephenson, a self-taught engineer whose life had been shaped by the coal mines of Northumberland. Unlike the well-educated Trevithick, Stephenson had learned his trade through practical experience, working his way up from engine fireman to engine wright. His intimate knowledge of mine engines and his methodical approach to problem-solving made him the ideal person to design not just locomotives, but an entire functioning railway system. The backers of the Stockton and Darlington had placed their faith in this practical man with calloused hands and determined eyes. The railway itself stretched approximately 25 miles across the gentle hills and valleys of County Durham. Its primary purpose was straightforward: to transport coal more efficiently than the existing combination of horse-drawn wagons and river navigation allowed. The industrialists and Quaker businessmen who had invested in the project, led by Edward Pease, understood that coal was the lifeblood of Britain's growing industrial economy. Any improvement in moving this black treasure from mine to market promised substantial profits. Stephenson had designed the railway with careful attention to gradient and curve, knowing that the primitive locomotives of the day could not handle steep inclines or sharp turns. Where the land rose too steeply, he incorporated stationary steam engines that would haul wagons up the slopes using cables. The track itself followed what would become known as standard gauge, with rails spaced 4 feet 8.5 inches apart, a dimension that Stephenson adopted from the wagonways he had known in the coal mines. This seemingly arbitrary measurement would eventually become the standard for railways across much of the world, though no one gathered that September morning could have imagined such a future. The locomotive that would lead the inaugural train was named Locomotion No. 1, designed and built by Stephenson and his son Robert at their works in Newcastle. It was a relatively simple machine by later standards, with 2 vertical cylinders driving wheels directly through connecting rods. The boiler was not particularly efficient, and the whole contraption had a slightly ungainly appearance, but it represented the accumulated wisdom of years of experimentation and refinement. Stephenson had learned from Trevithick's experiences, building a heavier locomotive that distributed its weight more evenly to avoid breaking the cast iron rails. As the morning progressed, the train began to take shape. Locomotion No. 1 stood at the head, steam wisping from its chimney. Behind it stretched a curious mixture of vehicles. There were wagons loaded with coal and flour, demonstrating the railway's freight capacity. but there were also specially fitted wagons carrying passengers, some 600 people in total who had come to experience this historic journey. Many stood in open coal wagons that had been hastily fitted with temporary seats, their Sunday best at risk from coal dust and locomotive sparks. Others travelled in what would seem a contradiction, a proper passenger coach called Experiment that was designed to be pulled by horses, not a locomotive. George Stephenson himself took position on the locomotive's footplate, determined to personally drive this first train. At a walking pace, locomotion number 1 began to move, its wheels gripping the iron rails as steam pressure built in its simple boiler. The connecting rods rose and fell in their rhythmic dance, and slowly, almost tentatively, the entire assemblage began rolling forward. The watching crowds cheered and waved handkerchiefs, some running alongside to keep pace with this mechanical marvel. The journey that followed was neither smooth nor swift by later standards. The locomotive managed speeds of 12 to 15 miles per hour on level stretches, though it slowed considerably on gradients. At times, the train had to stop to build up steam pressure, and horses were indeed used for some portions of the route where the locomotive struggled. Yet for all its imperfections, the journey represented something profound. Here was a working railway, carrying both freight and passengers, using a steam locomotive as its primary power source. This was not a one-time demonstration or an industrial novelty, but the beginning of regular commercial operation. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened for business the following day, and the reality of railway operation quickly settled into a pattern that mixed old and new. The steam locomotives, including locomotion and its sister engines, primarily hauled coal trains along the route. These freight services operated under the railway company's direct control, with the company employing the engine crews and maintaining the locomotives. The movement of coal was too important to leave to chance, and the steam engines, despite their occasional temperamental behavior, proved far more economical than horses for heavy loads. Passenger services, however, developed differently than the founders had anticipated. The railway company had not initially intended to operate passenger trains at all, viewing people carrying as a minor sideline to coal haulage. Instead, they allowed independent operators to run passenger coaches along the track, paying tolls for the privilege, much as boats paid tolls to use canals. These coaches were pulled by horses, which could maintain steadier speeds for passenger comfort and were more reliable for scheduled services. For several years, passengers traveling on the Stockton and Darlington experienced the curious sight of steam locomotives thundering past with coal wagons while they rode in horse-drawn coaches on parallel tracks. This hybrid system revealed something important about the transition from old to new technology. The railway as a concept, the idea of guiding vehicles along fixed iron tracks, was immediately recognized as valuable. But the best source of power for different purposes remained an open question. Horses were familiar, reliable, and manageable. Steam locomotives were powerful but temperamental, requiring specialized knowledge to operate and maintain. The Stockton and Darlington Railway operated successfully precisely because it pragmatically used whatever worked best for each task. Word of the railway's success spread throughout Britain and beyond. Here at last was proof that steam railways could function as practical commercial enterprises, not merely experimental demonstrations. The volume of coal transported increased dramatically compared to the old wagon roads, and the railway's investors began to see returns on their capital. Other businessmen and engineers took note, beginning to imagine railways connecting their own cities and industries. George Stephenson's reputation grew accordingly. His methodical approach and practical success made him the most sought-after railway engineer in Britain. He would soon be called upon to design even more ambitious projects, including a railway between the great cities of Liverpool and Manchester. That project would demand innovations beyond what the modest Stockton and Darlington had required, but the principles established here, the standard gauge track, the carefully graded routes, the combination of practical engineering and commercial operation, would carry forward. As autumn turned to winter in 1825, Locomotion No. 1 continued its work, hauling coal wagons along the iron rails of County Durham. It was not a perfect machine, and the railway was not yet the transformative force it would become. But something fundamental had changed. The railway age had begun not with a dramatic flourish but with steady, practical work, moving coal from mines to markets, proving day by day that the future of transportation had arrived. The success of the Stockton and Darlington Railway had demonstrated that steam locomotives could haul coal and passengers along iron rails, but questions remained about their true potential. Could these mechanical beasts prove reliable enough, fast enough, and economical enough to justify building an entirely new kind of railway? One that would carry nothing but passengers and freight at speeds that would revolutionize travel between major cities? The Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company faced precisely this question as they planned their ambitious line connecting two of England's most important industrial centres. Liverpool, the great port where cotton arrived from America and manufactured goods departed for the world, needed a better connection to Manchester, the textile manufacturing powerhouse some 35 miles inland. The existing transport relied on the Bridgewater Canal and Turnpike roads, both slow and increasingly congested. The railway company had already committed to building their line, employing George Stephenson to survey the route and overcome the considerable engineering challenges it presented. But they remained uncertain about the best way to move trains along it. Some directors favored using stationary steam engines positioned at intervals along the line, pulling trains with cables. Others advocated for locomotives, but even among locomotive supporters, opinions differed sharply about which design would prove most effective. The debate grew heated enough that the company decided to settle the matter through open competition. They would hold trials to determine once and for all whether locomotives could meet their exacting requirements, and if so, which design deserved to power their railway into the future. The company published their challenge in the spring of 1829, offering a prize of £500 to the builder of the best locomotive. The requirements were specific and demanding. The engine must consume its own smoke to avoid nuisance to passengers. It must pull 3 times its own weight at a speed of 10 miles per hour. It must have 2 safety valves and an operational pressure gauge. Most challenging of all, it must complete 20 round trips along a test track at Rainhill, covering a total distance of 70 miles without mechanical failure. The location chosen for the trials, a relatively level stretch of track near the small village of Rainhill between Liverpool and Manchester, became the site of one of the most significant technological competitions in history. Throughout that warm September and early October, thousands of spectators gathered along the rails, transforming the trials into a public festival. Vendors sold refreshments, grandstands were erected for better viewing, and people traveled from considerable distances to witness these mechanical marvels compete. 5 locomotives were entered, though only 4 would actually run during the trials. The first to arrive was Cyclopt, built by Thomas Brandreth, which drew laughter and disbelief when it appeared. Rather than being powered by steam, it relied on a horse walking on a belt-driven platform. This curious contraption was quickly disqualified when the horse crashed through the platform floor, ending its brief and inglorious participation. Timothy Hackworth's Sans Pareil represented a more serious challenge. Hackworth, who had worked with George Stephenson and now managed the Stockton and Darlington Railway's locomotive works, built a powerful if unconventional machine. Heavy and robust, Sans Pareil performed reasonably well initially, but mechanical problems plagued it throughout the trials. A cylinder cracked, a water pump failed, and the engine consumed coal and water at prodigious rates that would have made regular operation uneconomical. The novelty, built by Swedish engineer John Ericsson and his partner John Braithwaite, captured the crowd's imagination immediately. Lighter and faster than its competitors, with a graceful appearance that suggested speed even when standing still, Novelty reached 30 miles per hour during trial runs, far exceeding the required 10. Spectators cheered as it raced past, seeming to prove that locomotives could indeed achieve remarkable velocities. But the emphasis on lightness and speed came at the cost of durability. Like Sans Pareil, Novelty suffered repeated mechanical failures, with boiler pipes breaking and joints leaking. It could not complete the required distance without stopping for repairs. The fourth entrant, Perseverance, built by Timothy Burstall, arrived damaged after its journey to Rainhill and never ran properly during the trials, managing only walking pace before being withdrawn. This left the rocket, built by George Stephenson and his son Robert, with assistance from engineer Henry Booth. The Stephensons had learned from years of locomotive construction, and their entry incorporated several revolutionary features that would define steam locomotive design for generations. Rather than using a single large flue to carry hot gases through the boiler, rocket employed 25 copper tubes, dramatically increasing the heating surface area and allowing the engine to generate steam far more efficiently. The cylinders were positioned at an angle, connecting directly to the driving wheels rather than using complex beam mechanisms. The exhaust steam was directed up the chimney, creating a draft that drew air through the fire, making it burn hotter and more intensely. Rocket was not the most beautiful locomotive at Rainhill, nor initially the fastest. But as the trials progressed day after day, it proved something more valuable than beauty or peak speed. It proved reliable. While competitors broke down and withdrew, Rocket continued running, hauling its required load at speeds averaging 15 miles per hour, sometimes reaching 24. It consumed its fuel efficiently, managed its water supply sensibly, and completed the full 70 miles without significant mechanical failure. The judges, watching Rocket perform run after successful run, saw the future taking shape before their eyes. Here was a machine that could work day after day, covering distances at speeds no horse could match, requiring only coal, water, and periodic maintenance. The theoretical promise of railway transportation was becoming practical reality. When the trials concluded in mid-October, the decision was unanimous. Rocket won the competition and the prize, but more importantly, it won vindication for the locomotive principle itself. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway would be powered by steam locomotives, not cables and stationary engines. Within months, orders poured in for locomotives built to Rocket's basic design, and other engineers studied its innovations carefully, incorporating them into their own machines. The Rainhill Trials marked a turning point not just in railway history but in the public perception of what these machines could achieve. Thousands of ordinary people had watched locomotives perform, race, and prove their capabilities. The railway was no longer an exotic curiosity or an industrial oddity relevant only to coal mines. It was becoming the transportation system of the future, and everyone could see it happening before their eyes on that autumn stretch of track near a small Lancashire village. As the crowds dispersed and the competing locomotives were either ordered or returned to their builders, the groundwork had been laid for an explosion of railway construction that would transform Britain and eventually the world. The victory of the Rocket at Rainhill had demonstrated beyond doubt that steam locomotion was practical, efficient, and ready for the future. When the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened for regular service in 1830, it proved something even more remarkable, that people would eagerly embrace this new form of transport. Within months, the railway was carrying thousands of passengers each week, far exceeding the expectations of its builders. Investors took notice, and across Britain, a transformation began that would reshape the entire nation. The success of that first major intercity railway sparked an enthusiasm that grew steadily through the 1830s. Entrepreneurs and engineers began proposing railways to connect other cities and towns. London to Birmingham, Newcastle to Carlisle, Bristol to Exeter, each new proposal seemed more ambitious than the last. Parliament found itself inundated with applications from companies seeking permission to build railways, each accompanied by elaborate surveys and projected profits that promised handsome returns for investors. By the mid-1840s, this steady interest had intensified into something approaching fever. Historians would later call it railway mania, and the term captures perfectly the speculative frenzy that gripped the nation. In 1845 alone, Parliament received proposals for over 600 new railway projects representing thousands upon thousands of miles of track. Not all of these schemes were sensible or even remotely practical, but the promise of wealth drew investors from every level of society. Servants invested their savings alongside merchants and aristocrats, all hoping to share in the extraordinary profits that railways seemed to guarantee. Newspapers devoted entire pages to railway news and stock prices. Coffee houses buzzed with speculation about which lines would succeed and which would falter. The mania created genuine fortunes for some, while others lost everything when poorly planned projects collapsed or when competition made routes unprofitable. The shares of railway companies traded at dizzying prices, sometimes doubling or tripling in value within weeks, only to crash just as dramatically when reality failed to match expectations. Yet amid this financial speculation, actual railways were being built at an unprecedented pace. The physical transformation of Britain proceeded in parallel with the paper wealth being created in London's financial markets. Engineers found themselves in extraordinary demand, their expertise required to survey routes, design structures, and oversee construction across the country simultaneously. This was the environment in which figures like Isambard Kingdom Brunel would make their mark, pushing the boundaries of what railway engineering could achieve. Brunel had already established his reputation with other projects when he was appointed chief engineer of the Great Western Railway, planned to connect London with Bristol. He approached the task with characteristic ambition, determined that his railway would be the finest in the world. Rather than simply accept the standard gauge that George Stephenson had established, Brunel designed his railway to use a broader gauge of 7 feet and a quarter inch, believing this would allow for faster, smoother, and more stable trains. The decision would later prove controversial, but it reflected Brunel's confidence and his willingness to challenge convention in pursuit of excellence. The Great Western Railway required engineering works of remarkable scale. Near Bath, Brunel designed Box Tunnel, which at nearly 2 miles long was the longest railway tunnel yet attempted. Critics declared it impossible, suggesting that passengers would suffocate or that the hillside would collapse during construction. Brunel proceeded regardless, and thousands of workers labored for years with gunpowder, picks, and shovels to bore through the solid rock. When completed, the tunnel stood as a testament to Victorian determination and engineering skill. Brunel's ambition extended to bridges and viaducts as well. The Maidenhead Railway Bridge, with its extraordinarily flat arches spanning the Thames, prompted observers to predict disaster, certain that the spans would collapse under the weight of trains. Instead, the bridge stood firm and stands still today, carrying far heavier trains than Brunel ever imagined. His Royal Albert Bridge at Saltash, completed later in his career, demonstrated even greater innovation, combining wrought iron and suspension principles to cross the River Tamar into Cornwall. While Brunel worked his magic in the West, other engineers tackled equally challenging projects elsewhere. Robert Stephenson, son of George, designed the Britannia Bridge to carry the Chester and Holyhead Railway across the Menai Strait into Wales. His solution involved massive rectangular iron tubes through which trains would run, supported on stone towers rising from the water. The scale of the project was breathtaking, with each tube weighing thousands of tons and requiring innovative hydraulic jacking systems to raise them into position. The railway network spreading across Britain created a new kind of landscape, one marked by cuttings and embankments, tunnels, and viaducts that modified the contours of the countryside to accommodate the relatively gentle gradients that locomotives required. These earthworks represented an extraordinary movement of soil and rock, accomplished almost entirely by human and animal muscle power. The scale of construction during railway mania exceeded anything Britain had seen before, transforming both the physical terrain and the economic geography of the nation. Not every railway project succeeded. Some schemes collapsed during construction when money ran out. Others completed their lines only to discover that projected traffic failed to materialize, leaving investors with worthless shares and communities with underused railways. The competitive frenzy meant that some towns ended up with multiple competing railways where one would have sufficed, while other areas remained unserved despite genuine need. The speculation had its victims, both financial and human. Yet despite the excesses and failures, railway mania left Britain with an extensive railway network that connected virtually every significant town and city. By 1850, passengers could travel from London to Scotland, from the industrial Midlands to seaside resorts, from mining districts to market towns, all by rail. Journey times that had once consumed days now required merely hours. The isolation that had characterized rural life for centuries began to dissolve as railways brought not just transportation but also news, mail, and goods from distant places. The transformation rippled through every aspect of life. Agriculture changed as fresh produce could reach urban markets overnight. Industries relocated to take advantage of better transport connections. Resorts developed along coastlines, suddenly accessible for weekend excursions. The pace of life itself seemed to accelerate, matched to the rhythm of railway timetables rather than the slower cadence of horse-drawn coaches. As Britain rushed to cover itself with iron rails and magnificent engineering works, other nations watched with fascination and began planning their own railway systems, each hoping to capture the same economic and social benefits that seemed to flow from these remarkable machines and the tracks they ran upon. The fever of railway mania had gripped Britain, and now the dreams sketched on paper had to become reality carved into the landscape itself. Across the countryside, from the rolling hills of the Midlands to the rocky coasts of Cornwall, the work of building the iron roads began in earnest. What had seemed so simple in the boardrooms of London and Manchester proved to be an endeavour of extraordinary complexity and determination. Before a single rail could be laid, surveyors walked the proposed routes with their instruments, calculating gradients and plotting courses through terrain that had remained unchanged for millennia. These men carried theodolites and levels, measuring chains and notebooks, marking out paths that would need to remain as level as possible. Steam locomotives of the era could not climb steep gradients easily, so engineers sought routes that followed river valleys, skirted around hills, or found the gentlest passes through higher ground. Every route was a compromise between directness and practicality, between the ideal straight line and the stubborn reality of the earth itself. When the surveys were complete and the Acts of Parliament secured, the real work began. Into the countryside came the navvies, thousands upon thousands of labourers who would shape the land with their own hands. The word navvy came from navigator, the term used for the men who had dug Britain's canals decades earlier. Many were indeed former canal workers, but they were joined by agricultural labourers, Irish immigrants fleeing famine, and men from across Britain seeking wages and adventure. They lived in temporary camps along the route, rough settlements of wooden huts and canvas tents that moved forward as the railway advanced. The tools of these men were simple and ancient. Picks to break the ground, shovels to lift the earth, wheelbarrows to carry it away. When rock was encountered, they drilled holes by hand and packed them with gunpowder, then retreated to safety before the blast. The work was measured in cubic yards of earth moved, and a good navvy might shift 20 tons in a single day. They worked in gangs, often organized by the piece rather than by the hour, which encouraged both speed and cooperation. Songs and chants kept rhythm as they worked, the same cadences that sailors used at sea and soldiers used on the march. Where the route crossed low ground or needed to remain level, embankments rose from the landscape like ancient earthworks. Workers filled wheelbarrows with soil and stone, then pushed them up temporary wooden ramps to dump their loads where the railway would run. Layer by layer, these embankments grew until they stood 30 or 40 feet above the surrounding fields, broad enough at their base to remain stable under the weight of passing trains. The earth came from cuttings elsewhere along the route, where the railway needed to pass through higher ground. These cuttings were wound sliced through hills and ridges, exposing layers of soil and stone that had been hidden since the world was young. Navvies worked from the top downward, cutting benches and terraces as they descended. In places, the cuttings ran deep enough to become artificial valleys, their sides carefully graded to prevent collapse. The chalk downs of southern England showed brilliant white where they were cut. In the Midlands, layers of red sandstone emerged. Further north, the harder rocks required more blasting and more patience. The grandest challenges inspired the most ambitious solutions. When a hill proved too massive to cut through economically, engineers designed tunnels. These were projects of exceptional difficulty and danger. Workers sank shafts from the surface at intervals along the proposed route, sometimes descending hundreds of feet through solid rock. From the bottom of these shafts, they dug horizontally in both directions, working toward adjacent shafts to complete the tunnel. The work proceeded in darkness lit by candles and later by gas lamps, with water constantly seeping from the surrounding stone. Pumps driven by steam engines fought to keep the workings from flooding. The air grew foul with smoke from blasting and the breath of laboring men. Accidents were common, from rockfalls to premature explosions. The box tunnel on Brunel's Great Western Railway stretched for nearly 2 miles beneath the Cotswold Hills, requiring 5 years to complete and employing over 4,000 men at the peak of construction. A ton of gunpowder was used every week for blasting. More than 100 workers lost their lives during its construction, victims of falls, floods, and explosions that were considered an inevitable cost of such ambitious undertakings. Where valleys interrupted the route, viaducts carried the railway across empty air. These structures combined grace and strength in ways that still inspire wonder. Stone viaducts rose on multiple arches, each one carefully constructed around wooden frameworks called centering that held the stones in position until the keystone locked everything in place. Brick viaducts used millions of individual bricks, each one laid by hand and mortared into place. The larger viaducts employed hundreds of masons and bricklayers working simultaneously, their efforts coordinated with the precision of a military campaign. Some engineers experimented with timber viaducts, particularly in regions where good building stone was scarce or where speed of construction was essential. These wooden structures stood on tall trestles, their frameworks reminiscent of medieval cathedrals turned on their side. They were cheaper and faster to build than stone or brick, though they required constant maintenance and eventual replacement. Rivers presented their own challenges. Some could be crossed by raising embankments and running the railway over bridges at the normal track level. Larger rivers required substantial bridges of stone, brick, or increasingly of iron. The railway age coincided with advances in iron bridge construction, and engineers grew bolder in their spans. Cast iron arches curved gracefully over waterways, while wrought iron beams and trusses created frameworks of geometric precision. Robert Stephenson's Britannia Bridge, carrying the railway across the Menai Strait to Anglesey, used rectangular iron tubes large enough for trains to pass through, a revolutionary concept that pushed contemporary engineering to its limits. The land itself often surprised the builders. Clay soils proved unstable, shifting and settling under the weight of embankments. Peat bogs swallowed fill material as fast as it could be dumped, requiring workers to excavate down to firmer ground or float the railway on vast mattresses of bundled branches. Underground springs turned excavations into lakes overnight. Ancient geological faults meant rock could be solid on one side of a cutting and fractured on the other. As the physical route took shape, the final stage involved laying the track itself. Heavy stone blocks called sleepers were positioned at regular intervals along the formation, then later replaced by wooden ties that proved more practical. Iron rails, delivered by wagon or along completed sections of track, were fixed to the sleepers with iron chairs and wooden wedges or later with metal spikes. The gauge had to be exact, the joints carefully aligned so trains could run smoothly at speed. The pace of progress varied enormously depending on terrain and weather. On favorable ground with experienced workers and good conditions, a mile might be completed in weeks. Difficult sections could take months or years. Behind the advancing railhead came the permanent features of the railway, stations and signal boxes, water towers and coal stages, workshops and engine sheds. The transformation of the landscape was profound and permanent. Railways ignored ancient property boundaries and medieval field patterns, cutting straight paths through countryside that had been shaped by centuries of agricultural tradition. What had taken nature millennia to create was reshaped in years by human determination and the simple tools of pick and shovel multiplied by thousands of laboring hands. The navvies had carved their paths through hills and valleys, their picks and shovels had sculpted the landscape into ribbons of possibility, and now, as railways proliferated across Britain and began spreading to distant shores, a more subtle challenge emerged from the dust of construction. It was not merely enough to lay iron rails upon the earth. These rails had to speak to one another in a common language, had to follow agreed-upon rules, had to function as part of an interconnected system rather than isolated fragments of individual vision. In the earliest days of railway building, each line was largely its own kingdom, conceived and constructed according to the preferences of its particular engineers and investors. And perhaps no decision seemed more fundamental, more intimately tied to the very bones of a railway, than the width between the rails, what engineers called the gauge. This measurement, taken from the inner edge of one rail to the inner edge of its partner, would determine what locomotives could run upon the tracks, what cargo could be carried, and whether passengers could journey smoothly from one railway company's territory into another's. George Stephenson, whose rocket had triumphed at Rainhill, favored a gauge of 4 feet 8½ inches. This oddly specific measurement had its roots in the ancient wagonways of the coal mines where Stephenson had learned his craft. Some said it traced back further still, to the ruts worn by Roman chariots into British roads, though this charming origin story blends more romance than verifiable fact. Regardless of its ancestry, Stephenson's gauge became standard on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway and spread to many of the lines that followed, earning the straightforward designation of standard gauge. But Isambard Kingdom Brunel, that titan of Victorian engineering whose ambition seemed to dwarf those of ordinary mortals, looked upon Stephenson's gauge and found it wanting. When designing the Great Western Railway from London to Bristol, Brunel envisioned something grander, smoother, and swifter than anything yet attempted. He believed a broader gauge would allow for larger, more stable locomotives and more spacious carriages that could glide with greater comfort at higher speeds. After careful consideration and calculation, Brunel settled upon 7 feet and 1/4 inch, a full 2½ feet wider than standard gauge. The Great Western Railway, completed in stages through the 1830s and 40s, became a monument to Brunel's vision. His broad gauge trains did indeed ride with exceptional smoothness, their wide-set wheels providing remarkable stability. Passengers marveled at the spacious carriages and the ease of travel. For a time, it seemed Brunel's gamble might establish itself as a superior alternative, perhaps even eventually replacing Stephenson's narrower tracks. Yet railways existed not in isolation but as networks, and herein lay the fatal flaw of gauge diversity. When a train running on standard gauge tracks arrived at a junction where broad gauge began, it could proceed no further. Cargo had to be unloaded from one set of wagons and laboriously transferred to another. Passengers had to disembark, gather their belongings, and board entirely different carriages. These break-of-gauge points became scenes of considerable frustration and delay, small battlegrounds where the incompatibility of systems revealed itself in practical inconvenience. As Britain's railway network expanded through the 1840s, the gauge question evolved from a technical debate among engineers into a matter of national concern. Parliament established a gauge commission in 1845 to investigate and recommend a solution. The commission conducted tests, gathered evidence, and weighed the merits of both systems. While acknowledging the technical advantages of broad gauge, the commissioners faced an unavoidable reality. Far more miles of standard gauge track already existed, and continuing to build incompatible systems would fragment the nation's transportation network into disconnected islands. The Gauge Act of 1846 represented Parliament's decisive intervention. New railways in Britain would be required to use standard gauge, save for extensions of already existing broad gauge lines. It was a victory of compatibility over theoretical perfection, of network effects over individual engineering preference. Brunel's broad gauge would continue operating on the Great Western Railway for decades, but its fate was sealed, a magnificent dead end, gradually converted to standard gauge in a process that culminated in 1892. Yet gauge was merely one element requiring standardization as railways matured from individual experiments into complex systems. The very measurement of time itself had to be reimagined. Before railways, each town kept its own local time, determined by the sun's position overhead at noon. Bristol time ran some 11 minutes behind London time, and as one travelled westward across Britain, clocks shifted accordingly. This mattered little when journeys took days, but railway timetables required precision. How could a train maintain a published schedule when noon occurred at different moments in different places? The Great Western Railway, ironically enough, pioneered the solution to this temporal confusion. By 1840, it had adopted what it called London time, later known as railway time, throughout its entire network. Gradually, other railway companies followed suit. Station clocks displayed railway time while town clocks maintained local traditions, creating a peculiar duality that persisted for years. Only in 1880 did the British government officially adopt Greenwich Mean Time as the nation's standard, formalizing what railways had already established through practical necessity. Signalling systems required similar evolution from chaos toward order. Early railways operated with minimal communication between trains and stations. Drivers proceeded based on time intervals, hoping sufficient distance separated them from the train ahead. This time interval system functioned adequately while trains were infrequent, but as traffic increased, so did the risk of collision. The solution emerged gradually: fixed signals beside the tracks that could communicate permission to proceed or requirements to stop. The earliest signals took many forms. Some railways employed policemen stationed at intervals who displayed flags or lamps to indicate track conditions ahead. Others experimented with mechanical signals, rotating boards, rising balls, or swinging arms mounted on posts. The semaphore signal, featuring movable arms extending from a tall post, eventually established itself as standard practice. An arm extended horizontally commanded stop, while an arm angled downward granted permission to proceed. At night, colored lamps conveyed the same messages: red for danger, green for caution, white for clear track, though white later gave way to green to avoid confusion with ordinary lights. Telegraph technology, spreading alongside the railways themselves, transformed signaling from a local affair to a networked system. Signal boxes positioned at intervals along the line could communicate instantly, reporting when trains passed and controlling the mechanical interlocking of points and signals. This interlocking represented a crucial safety innovation. Physical connections between levers ensured that signals could not grant permission to proceed if points were incorrectly set, and points could not be moved while trains occupied the affected section of track. These systems emerged not from grand planning but from accumulated experience, often learned through tragedy. Each accident investigation revealed weaknesses, prompted innovations, generated new rules. The railways were learning to manage complexity, developing protocols for an interconnected technological system more intricate than anything human civilization had previously attempted to coordinate. As the techniques and standards refined in Britain spread to railways being built across Europe, America, and beyond, they carried with them these hard-won lessons. The story of gauges and standards was, at its heart, a story about connection, about transforming isolated lines of iron into truly connected systems that could shrink distances and unite distant places into something approaching a single, coordinated whole. As the technical foundations of railway systems were being established across Britain and Europe, another vast landscape beckoned across the Atlantic Ocean. North America presented railway builders with challenges and opportunities unlike anything the Old World had encountered. Here was a continent of seemingly endless distances, rugged mountain ranges, dense forests, and wide rivers that needed crossing. The American railway story would unfold on a grand scale, shaped by the distinctive character of a young nation expanding westward. The first tentative steps toward American railways came in the late 1820s and early 1830s, when several short lines began operation along the eastern seaboard. These early ventures borrowed heavily from British experience, yet they quickly began developing their own character. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, aimed to connect the port city of Baltimore with the Ohio River, a distance that would eventually span hundreds of miles through challenging terrain. The Charleston and Hamburg Railroad in South Carolina became one of the earliest successful lines, while the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad in New York began linking communities in 1831. American engineers and investors watched developments in Britain with keen interest, but they soon realized that simply copying British methods would not suffice. The American landscape demanded different solutions. British railways operated across a relatively compact, well-established nation with substantial capital and skilled workers. American railways faced vast, often unsettled territories with limited resources spread thinly across great distances. Where British railways could afford to build solidly with expensive engineering works, American railways needed to cover ground quickly and economically. This practical necessity led to distinctive American innovations. The locomotives that emerged from American workshops reflected these different priorities. Rather than the rigid, heavy engines favored in Britain, American designers created more flexible machines that could navigate sharper curves and rougher tracks. The development of the swiveling front truck, a set of wheels that could pivot independently beneath the locomotive's front end, allowed engines to follow winding routes more easily. This innovation, refined by various engineers during the 1830s, became a hallmark of American locomotive design. American tracks themselves reflected similar compromises between cost and coverage. While British railways increasingly standardized on heavy iron rails mounted on substantial foundations, early American lines often made do with lighter materials and simpler construction. Wooden rails topped with iron strips served many early railways, though these strap rails had an unfortunate tendency to curl up and pierce through passenger cars, creating dangers that engineers constantly worked to address. The abundance of timber in North America also influenced construction methods, with wooden trestle bridges spanning valleys where British engineers might have built stone viaducts. The physical character of American locomotives developed its own aesthetic. The diamond-shaped smokestack with its spark arrestor became iconic, necessary because wood-burning engines sent showers of embers into the air as they traveled through forested regions. The large pilot or cowcatcher mounted at the front of engines served a practical purpose on unfenced lines where livestock and other obstacles might wander onto the tracks. An enclosed cab protected the crew from harsh weather during long journeys across exposed landscapes. These features gave American locomotives a distinctive appearance that differed markedly from their British cousins. As the 1830s and 40s progressed, railway networks spread rapidly through the eastern and middle states. Lines pushed northward into New England, southward through Virginia and the Carolinas, and westward toward the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Each new line opened territories for settlement and commerce, carrying manufactured goods westward and agricultural products back to eastern cities and ports. The railways accelerated patterns of movement and development that had already begun along canals and roads, but at speeds and capacities that earlier transportation could never match. The human stories behind this expansion involved remarkable determination and vision. Engineers surveyed routes through wilderness, making calculations about grades and curves that would allow trains to climb mountains and navigate river valleys. Investors risked fortunes on lines that might take years to complete and longer still to show profits. Workers cleared forests, blasted through rock, and laid track mile after mile, often in difficult conditions far from settled communities. The scale of construction required new forms of organization and management that would later influence American business practices beyond the railway industry. Different regions developed their own railway characters reflecting local needs and geography. Southern railways connected cotton-growing regions with ports for export. Northern lines linked industrial cities with coal mines and sources of raw materials. Western railways pushed toward the frontier, often reaching new territories before permanent settlements had fully established themselves. This pattern, where railways preceded rather than followed development, distinguished much American railway building from European practices where lines typically connected already substantial communities. The technology continued evolving to meet American conditions. Locomotives grew more powerful to handle heavier loads across longer distances. Passenger cars became larger and more comfortable for journeys that might last days rather than hours. The development of the sleeping car, which would be refined and perfected by George Pullman in the 1860s, recognized that American railway travel required accommodations for overnight journeys. Freight cars specialized for different cargoes, from boxcars for manufactured goods to flat cars for timber and livestock cars for transporting animals to market. By the 1850s, major eastern cities found themselves connected by railway networks that had barely existed 2 decades earlier. A traveler could journey from Boston to Chicago, or from New York to St. Louis, entirely by rail in a fraction of the time such trips had previously required. The railways were knitting together the eastern half of the continent, creating a more integrated economy and society. Yet the greatest challenge still lay ahead, beckoning from beyond the Mississippi River, across the Great Plains and over the towering mountain ranges that separated the east from the distant Pacific coast. The dream of spanning the entire continent with iron rails had captured imaginations, and the groundwork laid by these earlier lines would make that seemingly impossible vision achievable. The dream of a transcontinental railroad across America had captivated imaginations long before the first spike was driven into Western soil. In the decades before the Civil War, surveyors and visionaries had argued over routes, drawn maps, and debated whether such an ambitious undertaking was even possible. The vast distances, the towering mountain ranges, and the harsh deserts between the settled east and the distant Pacific coast presented obstacles that seemed almost insurmountable. Yet the discovery of gold in California, the settlement of Oregon, and the vast territories acquired through westward expansion made such a connection feel increasingly necessary. The question was never merely technical. Political tensions between North and South complicated every discussion about where such a railroad might run. Would it follow a southern route through Texas and the desert Southwest? Or perhaps a northern path through the territories of Nebraska and Wyoming? Each proposed alignment carried implications for commerce, settlement, and the delicate balance of power in a nation approaching its greatest crisis. Only after the secession of the southern states did Congress finally settle on a central route, passing the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862. This legislation chartered 2 companies to build from opposite directions until they met somewhere in the middle. The Union Pacific would lay track westward from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific would begin in Sacramento, California, and work eastward across the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. The government offered both companies generous incentives, loans for each mile of track completed, and vast land grants that created a checkerboard of railroad-owned property stretching outward from the right-of-way. These lands could be sold to settlers, providing additional income to fund the enormous undertaking. When the Central Pacific began work in 1863, the challenges seemed overwhelming. The company's leaders, including dry goods merchant Leland Stanford, wholesale grocer Charles Crocker, and hardware dealer brothers Mark and Charles Hopkins, had no experience building railroads. Their chief engineer, Theodore Judah, had surveyed a possible route through the mountains, but he died before construction advanced far into the high country. Finding workers proved difficult in California, where many men preferred seeking their fortunes in mining rather than the hard labor of railroad construction. The solution came in the form of Chinese laborers, many of whom had already immigrated to California during the gold rush years. Initially viewed with skepticism by the railroad's construction supervisors, these workers soon proved themselves extraordinarily capable and disciplined. Teams of Chinese laborers mastered the dangerous work of blasting and tunneling through solid granite, carving 15 tunnels through the Sierra Nevada using black powder and, later, the more powerful nitroglycerine. They worked through brutal winters when snow accumulated to depths of 40 feet, sometimes living and working in tunnels carved through the snow itself, with chimneys providing air and light from above. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific pushed westward from Omaha across the Great Plains. Their construction gangs faced different challenges: vast treeless prairies where every wooden tie had to be shipped from distant forests, attacks from Native American warriors defending their hunting grounds, and the logistical puzzle of supplying thousands of workers hundreds of miles from the nearest established towns. The workers were predominantly Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and others willing to endure harsh conditions for steady wages. As construction progressed, temporary towns sprang up along the advancing railhead, rowdy settlements of tents and rough wooden buildings that moved with the construction camps. These mobile communities housed not just railroad workers but saloon keepers, gamblers, merchants, and others hoping to profit from the flush workers at payday. The towns disappeared as quickly as they appeared, leaving only the permanent way of iron rails behind. The engineering obstacles required constant innovation. The Central Pacific's crossing of the Sierra Nevada involved not just tunneling but the construction of massive retaining walls and trestles around sheer cliff faces. Workers were sometimes lowered in baskets to drill holes for explosives in vertical rock walls, a terrifying task that claimed numerous lives. Descending the eastern slopes of the Sierra into Nevada, the grade remained challenging, requiring careful calculation to keep the gradient within limits that locomotives could manage while hauling trains. The Union Pacific faced the formidable barrier of the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming, though their route through the relatively gentle South Pass and across the Continental Divide proved less technically demanding than the Sierra crossing. Still, the distances were immense, and every supply item had to be transported along the completed track. A vast logistical operation kept construction materials, food, and equipment flowing to the advancing railhead. As the two companies drew closer, competition intensified. Both received payment by the mile, creating incentive to build as much track as possible. At times, the grading crews of both companies were working parallel to each other, preparing roadbeds that would never be used. Congress eventually intervened to designate where the two lines would meet, at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory, north of the Great Salt Lake. On May 10, 1869, officials of both companies gathered for the ceremony that would mark completion of the Transcontinental Link. Telegraph wires had been connected to the ceremonial spike so that the moment of its driving would be transmitted simultaneously to cities across the nation. After several dignitaries made speeches and ceremonial spikes of gold and silver were presented, Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific and Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific took turns with the sledgehammer. When the final iron spike was driven home, completing the connection, the telegraph sent the simple message, "Done." The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad represented more than an engineering achievement. It transformed the geography of a nation, turning a journey that once took months by wagon or ship into a trip of less than a week. Towns and cities sprouted along the route. Ranchers could ship cattle to eastern markets. Manufactured goods flowed westward. The railroad both facilitated and accelerated the settlement of the West, bringing dramatic and often devastating changes to the native peoples whose lands were being transformed. The great work had required tremendous sacrifice. Hundreds of workers had died in construction accidents, from exposure, in avalanches, and from disease. The Chinese workers in particular had labored under dangerous conditions for lower wages than their white counterparts, yet their contribution to the railroad's completion was immeasurable. As the celebration concluded at Promontory Summit and the locomotives of the two railroads touched pilots in symbolic connection, a new era had begun, one where the continent had been bound together by ribbons of iron. With the American Transcontinental Railroad complete and the driving of the Golden Spike still fresh in the public imagination, the railways of Europe were experiencing their own remarkable transformation. While Britain had taken the lead in the earliest days of railway development, the nations of continental Europe were now building their own iron networks with distinctive approaches that reflected their unique political landscapes, geographical challenges, and national ambitions. France approached railway construction with characteristic centralization, radiating lines outward from Paris like the spokes of a great wheel. This pattern was no accident but rather a deliberate reflection of French political and cultural organization, where the capital had long served as the heart of national life. The first French railway had opened in 1827, a modest horse-drawn affair carrying coal near Saint-Étienne. But by the 1840s, steam locomotives were pulling passengers from Paris to Rouen, to Orleans, to the borders of the nation. The French government took an active role in planning these routes, granting concessions to private companies but maintaining oversight of the growing network. Engineers trained at the prestigious École Polytechnique brought mathematical precision to the task, producing railways that were often straighter and more elegantly designed than their British counterparts, though sometimes more expensive to construct. The German lands presented a different picture entirely. In the decades before unification, the territory we now know as Germany consisted of dozens of separate kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, each with its own government and interests. The first German railway opened in 1835, running just 6 kilometers from Nuremberg to Fürth in Bavaria, with a locomotive appropriately named Der Adler, the Eagle. As railways spread across these fragmented territories through the 1840s and 1850s, they began to weave connections between states that had previously remained separate worlds unto themselves. A merchant in Hamburg could now send goods to Munich, a student in Berlin could visit Cologne, all with a speed and ease that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. These steel connections helped create the economic and psychological groundwork for the eventual political unification of Germany in 1871. The railways had, in a sense, unified the nation before the politicians and generals completed the task. Belgium, though small in size, built one of Europe's most impressive railway networks with remarkable speed. After gaining independence from the Netherlands in 1830, the new nation saw railways as both an economic opportunity and a means of asserting its sovereignty. The Belgian state took direct control of railway construction, building a system that connected Antwerp, Brussels, Liège, and Ghent by the early 1840s. This network of lines formed a dense web across the small country, and Belgium's railway density, measured in miles of track per square mile of territory, soon became among the highest in the world. In the Italian peninsula, railways began to appear before unification, with different regions building lines under the authority of various ruling powers. The Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia constructed railways connecting Turin and Genoa. The Papal States built modest lines in central Italy. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies opened the first Italian railway in 1839, running from Naples to the Royal Palace at Portici, a short line built as much for prestige as practical transportation. After Italian unification in the 1860s, these scattered fragments gradually connected into a national system, though the mountainous spine of the Apennines and the economic disparities between north and south created challenges that persisted for generations. Spain faced particularly difficult terrain, with mountain ranges dividing the country and making railway construction expensive and technically demanding. The first Spanish railway opened in 1848, connecting Barcelona to Mataró along the Mediterranean coast. As the network expanded inward, engineers confronted steep grades and the need for numerous tunnels and bridges. Spain also chose a different track gauge from most of the rest of Europe, a decision intended to make foreign invasion more difficult, but one that would complicate international rail connections for more than a century. The Netherlands built railways across their flat, low-lying landscape with relative ease, though the watery terrain required careful engineering to ensure stable foundations. The first Dutch railway opened in 1839, connecting Amsterdam to Haarlem, and the network expanded steadily to link the nation's commercial centers. Danish railways began in the 1840s, connecting Copenhagen to other parts of Zealand before expanding to the Jutland Peninsula. Sweden and Norway built railways through landscapes of extraordinary beauty, where tracks wound through forests and along fjords, connecting Stockholm and Oslo to their surrounding territories. The Austrian Empire, vast and multipolitan, built railways that connected Vienna to the far reaches of imperial territory. The Vienna to Glognitz line, opened in stages beginning in 1842, climbed into the Alps through remarkable engineering works. The Semmering Railway, completed in 1854, was among the first true mountain railways, threading through tunnels and across viaducts to cross the barrier of the Alps. This achievement demonstrated that railways could go nearly anywhere human determination could drive them. Switzerland, landlocked among the mountains, eventually built one of Europe's most impressive railway networks, though the major Alpine crossings came later in the century. The Swiss carefully planned routes that would connect their scattered valleys and link their nation to the railways of neighboring countries, understanding that their prosperity depended on maintaining connections to the broader European economy. As these national networks expanded through the middle decades of the 19th century, they began to reach toward each other across borders. International connections required not just physical track but also diplomatic agreements, customs arrangements, and technical coordination. Different nations had built their railways with varying standards, and these differences needed reconciliation. The experience of crossing from one country to another by rail gradually became routine, though it often involved changing trains, presenting documents, and adjusting to different railway company procedures. The expansion of railways across Europe brought profound changes to daily life. Regions that had been days apart now sat mere hours from each other. Fresh fish from the coast reached inland cities while still edible. Newspapers printed in capital cities arrived in provincial towns the same day. People who had lived their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace could now visit distant cities for work or pleasure. The railways created a new sense of European interconnection, a feeling that the continent, despite its many languages and borders, was becoming a more unified space. Yet each nation's railway network also reflected and reinforced its own identity. The French network centered on Paris confirmed that city's dominance. The scattered networks of pre-unification Germany and Italy later helped define unified national territories. The railways served both connection and distinction, both international trade and national development, carrying forward into the modern age the complex relationship between cooperation and independence that has always characterized Europe. As railway networks spread across Europe and connected distant corners of continents, the engineers and architects of the Victorian age found themselves facing a glorious challenge. The railways demanded structures of unprecedented scale and ambition. Where tracks terminated in great cities, magnificent stations rose up like cathedrals of iron and glass. Where rivers ran deep and valleys yawned wide, bridges of extraordinary daring spanned the gaps. Where mountains stood immovable in the path of progress, tunnels bored through solid rock for miles. The railway age became an era of engineering marvels that still inspire wonder today. The great terminus stations represented something entirely new in architecture. These were not merely functional buildings but grand gateways between the old world and the new, between the intimate scale of city streets and the vast possibilities of railway travel. London Street Pancras Station, completed in 1868, combined William Henry Barlow's soaring train shed with George Gilbert Scott's Gothic Revival hotel facade. The train shed itself stretched an astonishing 243 feet in width without a single internal support column, its gracefully curving iron ribs holding up a roof of glass that flooded the platforms below with natural light. The hotel that fronted the station rose like a Victorian fantasy, all red brick and pointed arches and elaborate towers, as if a medieval palace had been transported through time to serve the modern age. Across the Thames, the elegant curve of Paddington Station showcased Isambard Kingdom Brunel's engineering vision combined with architect Matthew Digby Wyatt's decorative ironwork. Completed in 1854, Paddington featured 3 parallel spans of wrought iron and glass, with delicate tracery patterns that turned functional structural elements into objects of beauty. Travelers waiting for their trains could look up at iron columns decorated with botanical motifs, a reminder that Victorian engineers saw no contradiction between industrial materials and natural inspiration. In New York, Grand Central Terminal would eventually rise as perhaps the most magnificent railway station in America, though it wouldn't reach its final form until 1913. The main concourse stretched vast and cathedral-like, with windows arching high above and constellations painted across the ceiling in gold leaf against turquoise blue. The station became not just a place of arrival and departure but a destination in itself, a public space where the drama of travel unfolded beneath architectural grandeur. Paris built a ring of great terminal stations around its historic center, each serving different directions and regions. The Gare du Nord, rebuilt in the 1860s, featured a facade decorated with statues representing the destinations served by its trains. Inside, iron and glass vaults sheltered the platforms in luminous space. The Gare de Lyon, with its distinctive clock tower, combined practical function with Belle Epoque elegance. These stations announced that railway travel had become an integral part of national life, worthy of architectural celebration. Beyond the stations themselves, railways demanded bridges and viaducts of unprecedented scale. In Scotland, the Forth Bridge stands as perhaps the supreme achievement of Victorian railway engineering. Completed in 1890 after 7 years of construction, this cantilever bridge spans the Firth of Forth with 3 enormous double cantilever structures. The statistics alone inspire awe, over 1.5 miles long, constructed from more than 50,000 tons of steel, with towers rising 330 feet above the water. The distinctive red paint that coats every surface has made the bridge an icon, though the popular myth that painting it is a never-ending task proves somewhat exaggerated. The Forth Bridge represented a triumph of steel construction, built in the wake of the 1879 Tay Bridge disaster that had sobered the engineering profession with the reminder that ambition must be balanced with careful calculation and safety. Brunel's Royal Albert Bridge at Saltash, opened in 1859, demonstrated a different approach to bridging wide water. Here, wrought iron chains suspended from tall piers carry oval tubes through which the railway passes. The bridge spans the River Tamar between Devon and Cornwall with elegant efficiency, and Brunel's name appears emblazoned on the structure, though he died just months after its opening and was carried across it only once, on a special train travelling slowly enough that he could view his final achievement from a railway carriage bed. Railways also climbed mountains and crossed valleys on viaducts of startling height and beauty. The Glenfinnan Viaduct in the Scottish Highlands, completed in 1901, curves gracefully across the valley on 21 concrete arches, each reaching skyward in a gentle arc. Today it carries the Jacobite steam train through landscape that seems barely touched by human hands, though the viaduct itself represents a remarkable feat of construction in remote terrain. The technique of using concrete in such a major railway structure was relatively innovative at the time, and the viaduct has weathered over a century of highland weather with remarkable resilience. In southern France, the Garbit Viaduct designed by Gustave Eiffel demonstrated the master engineer's skill with iron structures before he turned his attention to his famous tower in Paris. Completed in 1884, the viaduct carries the railway 400 feet above the Truyère River on a delicate-looking lattice of iron that combines strength with visual lightness. Eiffel understood that engineering structures could possess grace as well as power. tunnels presented perhaps the greatest challenge of all. The Morne-Cenis tunnel through the Alps between France and Italy, completed in 1871 after 14 years of labor, stretched over 8 miles through solid rock. Workers drilling from both ends used new pneumatic drills powered by compressed air, advancing slowly through the mountain. When the two headings finally met, they aligned almost perfectly, a testament to precise surveying. The Simplon Tunnel, later to pierce the Alps between Switzerland and Italy, would eventually reach nearly 12 miles in length, but its completion lay in the future beyond the Victorian era. Britain's Severn Tunnel, opened in 1886 after 13 years of difficult construction, runs beneath the river between England and Wales. Workers battled constant flooding from underground springs, pumping millions of gallons daily while boring through rock beneath the riverbed. The tunnel stretched over 4 miles long, making it one of the longest mainline railway tunnels in Britain. Even today, powerful pumps work continuously to keep the tunnel dry and trains running. These engineering marvels transformed more than transportation. They changed how people understood what was possible. A bridge like the Forth carried trains hundreds of feet above water that earlier generations would have crossed only by boat. A station like St. Pancras created public spaces larger and more impressive than most cathedrals. A tunnel like the Severn allowed travelers to pass beneath a major river without ever seeing water. The railways demonstrated that human ingenuity could overcome nearly any obstacle that nature placed in its path. The structures also represented a new aesthetic of the industrial age. Iron and steel, glass and concrete became materials for beauty as well as function. The great stations glowed with natural light filtered through acres of glass. Bridges traced mathematical curves across empty air. Engineers became celebrities, their names associated with structures that dominated landscapes and city skylines. As the 19th century drew toward its close, these monuments to railway ambition stood complete. They carried millions of passengers and countless tons of freight, but they also carried something less tangible, a sense of possibility and progress that defined their era. The age had built its cathedrals, not to worship the divine but to celebrate human capability and connection. The great stations and engineering triumphs stood as monuments to industrial ambition, but within those soaring halls of iron and glass, a quieter transformation was taking place. For it was aboard the trains themselves that ordinary people experienced the railway revolution most intimately, settling into compartments and carriages that would carry them through landscapes their grandparents could never have imagined crossing in a single lifetime. In the earliest days of passenger rail travel, the distinctions between classes of service reflected the rigid social hierarchies of Victorian society with almost brutal clarity. First-class passengers enjoyed enclosed carriages with padded seats and glass windows, comfortable spaces that resembled the interiors of road coaches transferred onto railway wheels. Second-class travelers found themselves in less luxurious compartments, their seats adequate but unpadded, their accommodation serviceable rather than comfortable. Third-class passengers, however, often rode in open wagons with wooden benches, exposed to wind, rain, and the smoke and cinders that poured from the locomotive ahead. On cold winter journeys, these unfortunate travelers arrived at their destinations thoroughly chilled and blackened by soot, having paid their lower fare in considerable physical discomfort. The railway companies saw these third-class accommodations as little more than cattle trucks with seats, and indeed some early companies questioned whether such service should be offered at all. Yet the demand proved insatiable. Working people eager to visit family in distant towns, labourers travelling to find work, traders seeking new markets, all crowded onto these basic trains. In Britain, the Railway Regulation Act of 1844 compelled companies to offer at least one train per day on each line with third-class fares of no more than a penny per mile, travelling at a minimum speed of 12 miles per hour with passengers protected from the weather. These became known as parliamentary trains, and while the railway companies grumbled at this government interference, the services opened rail travel to vast numbers of people who had previously lived their entire lives within walking distance of their birthplace. As the decades progressed and competition between railway companies intensified, passenger comfort gradually improved across all classes. Third-class compartments gained roofs and eventually rudimentary upholstery. The divisions between classes remained, but the gap narrowed. By the late 19th century, even third-class passengers traveled in relative comfort, seated in cushioned compartments that would have seemed luxurious to their parents. For longer journeys, particularly across the vast distances of North America, mere seats proved insufficient. Passengers needed somewhere to sleep, some way to transform the railway carriage into temporary lodging. The sleeping car emerged as the solution, though early versions offered only basic arrangements. George Pullman revolutionized overnight rail travel in America during the 1860s with his palace car designs. These carriages featured seats that converted into lower berths at night, while upper berths folded down from the ceiling. Curtains provided privacy for each sleeping space, and porters attended to passengers' needs throughout the journey. Pullman's luxurious approach transformed the overnight train from an ordeal to be endured into an experience that wealthy travelers actively sought out. European railways developed their own variations on sleeping accommodations. Rather than the open design of Pullman cars, European sleepers typically featured individual compartments with seats that converted to beds, offering greater privacy in keeping with continental preferences. The company International des Wagons Lits, founded in 1872, created a network of luxury sleeping cars that operated across national borders, their distinctive blue and gold carriages becoming symbols of elegant international travel. Dining presented another challenge for long-distance rail travel. Initially, trains stopped at station restaurants where passengers rushed to consume hasty meals during brief intervals before whistles summoned them back aboard. The experience proved chaotic and unsatisfying, with cold food served at exorbitant prices to captive customers. The introduction of dining cars in the 1870s and 1880s changed everything. Passengers could now dine while rolling through the countryside, seated at tables set with crisp linens, proper china, and silverware. Kitchens aboard the trains prepared meals to order, with chefs somehow managing to create elaborate dishes despite the swaying of the carriage and the limitations of compact cooking spaces. The great-name trains of the late 19th and early 20th centuries elevated railway dining to extraordinary levels. The Orient Express, inaugurated in 1883, offered passengers cuisine that rivaled the finest Paris restaurants, served in elegant dining cars decorated with marquetry panels and crystal fixtures. Travelers crossing the American continent aboard trains like the Super Chief or the California Zephyr enjoyed regional specialties prepared by skilled chefs, dining on fresh trout caught from mountain streams or steaks from Midwestern cattle ranches, all while watching dramatic landscapes drift past their windows. These luxury trains introduced observation cars with large windows or even open platforms at the rear, allowing passengers to immerse themselves in the passing scenery. Lounge cars provided spaces for socializing, reading, or simply relaxing between destinations. Some trains included barber shops, ladies' maids, stenographers for business travelers, and even libraries stocked with current books and periodicals. Yet perhaps the most profound change railways brought to the passenger experience involved something less tangible than comfortable seats or fine dining. Trains fundamentally altered how people understood time and space. Before railways, a journey's duration depended on weather, road conditions, and the stamina of horses. Timetables existed only as rough estimates. Railways introduced precision to travel. Trains departed at specific minutes, followed scheduled routes, and arrived at predetermined times with increasing reliability. This regularity required the standardization of time itself. Before railways, each town kept its own local time based on the sun's position. The need to coordinate train schedules across distances led to the adoption of standard time zones, first in Britain and then spreading worldwide. The railway compartment also became an unusual social space where strangers from different backgrounds found themselves confined together for hours. In Britain, the compartment design with facing bench seats and no corridor access meant passengers spent entire journeys regarding whoever sat opposite, sometimes in awkward silence, sometimes in conversation that bridged social boundaries that would have remained impermeable elsewhere. In America, the open car design with its central aisle and rows of facing pairs of seats created a more democratic mixing, though racial segregation laws in some regions imposed cruel divisions that contradicted the railway's otherwise unifying influence. As the gentle rhythm of wheels on rails lulled countless travelers toward sleep over decades of journeys, the railway carriage became a distinctive space unlike any other. Neither fully private nor fully public, moving yet stationary relative to one's fellow passengers, the train existed in its own temporal and social dimension. Here fortunes changed hands in business negotiations, romances blossomed between strangers, and weary travelers surrendered to the peculiar tranquility that comes from surrendering control of movement to the machine, watching the world flow past like a dream. As the railway revolution gathered momentum across Europe and North America, its influence began to ripple outward across the globe, reaching distant shores where ancient civilizations would encounter the industrial age on iron rails. The story of railways in Asia and Africa represents a complex tapestry of ambition and transformation, where the technology that had reshaped the Western world would soon leave its mark on landscapes and societies that had evolved along entirely different paths for thousands of years. In India, the introduction of railways would create what became one of the most extensive railway networks anywhere on Earth. The first passenger train on the subcontinent departed from Bombay in April 1853, traveling just over 20 miles to the town of Thane. Behind this modest beginning lay grand visions of connecting the vast territories under British control. The journey that day took approximately an hour, with 14 carriages carrying some 400 passengers through the coastal landscape, their excitement palpable as they experienced this revolutionary form of transport for the first time. The expansion that followed proceeded with remarkable speed and scope. Engineers faced extraordinary challenges as they worked to lay tracks across the diverse terrain of the subcontinent. The great river systems required bridges on scales previously unattempted in that part of the world. The Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and countless other waterways had to be spanned with iron structures that could withstand monsoon floods and tropical heat. Through mountain passes and across arid plains, through dense forests where tigers still roamed and across cultivated fields that had fed civilization since ancient times, the railway lines extended their reach. The construction crews themselves represented a remarkable cross-section of humanity. Local labourers worked alongside British engineers, learning new skills and adapting traditional methods to industrial requirements. The work proved grueling, particularly during the hot season when temperatures could make the iron rails too hot to touch. Yet the network grew, connecting Calcutta and Delhi, reaching southward to Madras and westward toward the Arabian Sea. By the end of the 19th century, India possessed thousands of miles of functioning railway, a network that would continue expanding well into the 20th century. These railways carried more than passengers and freight. They transported ideas, languages, and customs across regions that had previously remained relatively isolated from one another. Markets that had once served only local areas suddenly connected to distant cities. Fresh fish from coastal waters could reach inland populations within hours rather than days. Agricultural products from fertile regions found new customers in growing urban centers. The rhythm of economic life began to synchronize with railway timetables. In Southeast Asia, railways began threading through landscapes of remarkable beauty and formidable obstacle. The construction of lines through Malaya, connecting tin mining regions to coastal ports, required engineers to contend with tropical conditions that could rot wooden sleepers in months and rust metal components with remarkable speed. In what was then called Siam, now Thailand, railway development proceeded more gradually, with lines extending northward from Bangkok into regions where traditional ways of life had persisted unchanged for generations. Perhaps no railway in Africa captured more attention or generated more dramatic stories than the Uganda Railway, which began construction in 1896 from the port of Mombasa on the Indian Ocean coast. The objective was to reach Lake Victoria, some 600 miles inland, opening access to the interior of East Africa. The project required workers to be brought from India, as local populations proved insufficient or unwilling to provide the necessary labor force in adequate numbers. The challenges encountered during construction almost defy belief. The railway had to climb from sea level to over 5,000 feet elevation, traversing territories where lions still hunted freely. Stories emerged of man-eating lions at Tsavo who attacked workers in their camps at night, creating an atmosphere of terror that halted construction until the animals could be hunted down. Beyond the threat from wildlife, workers faced diseases like malaria and dysentery, accidents from working with heavy equipment in difficult terrain, and the sheer physical exhaustion of moving earth and laying track in tropical heat. Despite these obstacles, the railway reached Lake Victoria in 1901, creating a continuous link from the coast to the Great Lake that lay at the heart of the African continent. The line passed through the Rift Valley, offering travelers views of landscapes that seemed to belong to the world's ancient past. Herds of zebra and antelope could be spotted from carriage windows. Distant volcanic peaks rose against horizons that stretched toward infinity. In South Africa, railway development proceeded along different lines, driven by the discovery of diamonds and gold that transformed the region's economy. Lines reached inland from Cape Town and from ports along the eastern coast, converging on the mining centers where fortunes were being extracted from beneath the earth. The railways here connected not just cities but economic interests, moving ore and equipment, bringing in supplies and workers to feed the appetite of mines that seemed to grow larger and deeper with each passing year. The stations built along these African and Asian railways often reflected architectural styles borrowed from Europe, creating curious juxtapositions where Victorian buildings with their distinctive ironwork and brick construction stood amid landscapes of palm trees and acacia, monsoon rains, and desert winds. These structures became focal points for the communities that grew around them, places where different cultures encountered one another in the shared experience of railway travel. The impact of these colonial railways extended far beyond simple transportation. They opened regions to trade and development that had previously remained largely untouched by industrial economics. Tea plantations in the highlands of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, gained access to export markets. Coffee from East Africa could reach European breakfast tables. The flow worked in both directions, with manufactured goods from Birmingham and Manchester arriving in markets across Asia and Africa. As comfortable darkness settles around us like a familiar blanket, we might picture those early trains moving through landscapes of astonishing variety, carrying their diverse passengers toward destinations that represented both promise and uncertainty. The whistle of a locomotive echoing across an Indian plain at sunset, or the sight of a train crossing a viaduct above an African valley, these images capture a moment when the world was becoming smaller, when distances that had once seemed impossible were being measured in hours rather than weeks, and when the technology born in the coal fields and ironworks of Britain was reshaping human experience across continents. As railways spread their iron tendrils across continents and colonies, connecting distant lands with the rhythmic pulse of steam and steel, a remarkable era was dawning. The decades spanning from the early 1900s through the 1930s would come to represent something special in railway history, a time when steam technology reached its magnificent zenith, when locomotives became not merely machines of transportation but symbols of national pride, engineering excellence, and romantic adventure. The turn of the 20th century found railway companies around the world engaged in something of a friendly competition, each seeking to outdo the others with faster, more powerful, and more beautiful locomotives. Engineers had learned much from decades of experience, and they applied this knowledge to create machines that seemed to embody grace and strength in equal measure. Gone were the crude, ungainly designs of early steam engines. In their place emerged locomotives that gleamed with polished brass and painted livery, their streamlined forms suggesting speed even when standing still at the platform. In Britain, the great railway companies commissioned increasingly sophisticated express engines to haul their premier services. The Great Western Railway continued its tradition of excellence with locomotives that bore names evoking British castles, kings, and nobility. The London and North Eastern Railway created magnificent engines painted in apple green, their long boilers and large driving wheels designed for sustained high speed running on the routes between London, York, and Edinburgh. The London Midland and Scottish Railway responded with its own stable of powerful machines, finished in crimson lake that caught the light as they thundered through the countryside. These weren't simply functional machines. The railway companies understood that their locomotives were the public face of their operations, the gleaming ambassadors that greeted passengers at stations and flashed past country crossings. They invested considerable resources in maintaining their appearance, with teams of cleaners ensuring that brasswork sparkled and paintwork shone. The most important express engines received particularly lavish attention, becoming objects of admiration for railway enthusiasts and casual observers alike. The engineering advances of this golden age were substantial. Locomotives grew larger and more complex, incorporating innovations in valve gear, boiler design, and metallurgy that extracted ever more power from steam. British engineer Sir Nigel Gresley designed locomotives with 3 cylinders instead of the traditional 2, creating smoother power delivery and reduced wear on the track. His creations included engines capable of sustained running at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, a remarkable achievement for machines powered by coal and water. Across the Atlantic, American railways pursued a different philosophy, prioritizing raw power and reliability over outright speed. The vast distances and challenging terrain of North America demanded locomotives that could haul enormous loads across mountain ranges and prairies. American engineers developed increasingly large engines, including articulated designs where 2 sets of driving wheels could pivot independently, allowing enormous machines to navigate curves that would have been impossible for rigid-frame locomotives. Some of these giants weighed over £500,000 and could pull freight trains stretching for miles behind them. The Golden Age gave birth to named trains that captured the public imagination and became institutions in their own right. The Orient Express, which had begun running from Paris to Constantinople in the 1880s, reached its peak of luxury and glamour during these decades. Passengers in its elegant dining and sleeping cars enjoyed cuisine prepared by master chefs, slept in compartments fitted with fine wood paneling and plush fabrics, and watched the changing landscapes of Europe glide past their windows. The train became synonymous with mystery, romance, and international intrigue, inspiring countless stories and legends. In Britain, the Flying Scotsman service connected London and Edinburgh, covering the nearly 400 miles in just over 7 hours by the 1930s. The locomotive chosen to haul this prestigious train also bore the name Flying Scotsman, and it became perhaps the most famous steam engine in the world. In 1934, this machine achieved the first authenticated speed of 100 miles per hour by a steam locomotive, a feat that generated headlines and secured its place in history. American railways created their own legendary named trains. The 20th Century Limited, operated by the New York Central Railroad, offered first-class passengers a supremely comfortable overnight journey between New York and Chicago. The train featured observation cars with rounded rear ends where passengers could watch the tracks recede into the distance, dining cars serving meals that rivaled fine restaurants, and sleeping compartments designed for maximum comfort. A crimson carpet was rolled out at the platform for boarding passengers, giving rise to the expression red carpet treatment. The Golden Age also saw remarkable developments in luxury and comfort for passengers willing to pay premium fares. Railway companies competed to offer the finest amenities, understanding that businessmen, wealthy travelers, and tourists would choose their services based on the quality of the journey itself. Observation cars with large windows and comfortable seating allowed passengers to appreciate scenic routes. Some railways introduced cars with glass roofs, creating mobile conservatories where passengers could dine while surrounded by panoramic views. The streamlining movement of the 1930s brought a new aesthetic to locomotive design. Influenced by emerging ideas about aerodynamics and modern design, some railways enclosed their locomotives in smooth, curved casings that gave them a sleek, futuristic appearance. The German railways introduced high-speed diesel trains with streamlined profiles. In America, locomotives received dramatic Art Deco styling with shrouds that made them look like they were moving even when stationary. These streamlined trains represented optimism about technology and progress, capturing something of the era's fascination with speed and modernity. Throughout this golden age, railways remained central to economic life and social connection. They carried businessmen to important meetings, families on holiday excursions, mail and newspapers that kept communities informed, and the endless flow of goods that sustained modern economies. Station clocks became the standards by which entire nations set their watches. The railway timetable governed daily routines for millions of people, creating rhythms of departure and arrival that structured modern life. For those who worked on the railways, the Golden Age offered a particular kind of pride. Locomotive crews developed deep knowledge of their machines and routes, understanding every gradient, curve, and signal on their regular runs. Firemen learned the art of managing the fire to maintain steady steam pressure, while drivers developed the judgment needed to coax maximum performance while ensuring passenger comfort and safety. Station staff took pride in the smooth operation of their platforms, the punctuality of departures, and the service they provided to travelers. As the 1930s drew toward their close, this golden age of steam stood at its peak, seemingly secure in its dominance of land transportation. The great locomotives continued their daily runs, connecting cities and spanning continents with reliable, powerful service. Yet change was already gathering on the horizon, though few could have predicted how profoundly the coming years would transform the railways and the world they served. As the steam age reached its magnificent zenith, the world discovered that railways possessed another quality beyond their ability to carry passengers and freight. The iron roads that had connected cities and shrunk distances between continents would soon prove essential in an altogether darker purpose. When nations turned toward conflict, the same networks that had carried tourists to seaside resorts and merchants to market towns would become arteries of war, pulsing with soldiers and ammunition. The transformation became apparent during the American Civil War in the 1860s. For the first time in history, military commanders could move entire armies hundreds of miles in days rather than weeks. The Union's superior railway network, with over 20,000 miles of track concentrated in the industrialized North, provided an advantage that would prove decisive. Troops could be shifted from one threatened front to another with unprecedented speed. Supplies that once required endless wagon trains could now flow in continuous streams behind the advancing forces. The Confederacy understood this reality all too well. With a railway system less than half the size of the Union's, and lacking the industrial capacity to maintain and expand it, the South found itself in a losing race. Railway junctions became prime targets. The war introduced the world to systematic railway destruction, as both sides learned to heat rails over bonfires and twist them around trees, creating what soldiers grimly called Sherman's neckties. Control of key railway towns like Atlanta and Chattanooga determined entire campaigns. European military observers took careful note. By the time Prussia unified Germany in 1871, the Prussian General Staff had made railways central to their military planning. They studied timetables as carefully as battlefield maps, calculating precisely how many trains would be needed to move an army corps from peacetime barracks to potential frontiers. The German railway system was deliberately designed with strategic considerations in mind, ensuring that multiple lines ran toward the borders with France and Russia. This railway-centered military thinking reached its apex in 1914, when the great European powers activated mobilization plans that resembled nothing so much as enormous, inflexible railway schedules. Germany's famous Schlieffen Plan depended on moving armies through Belgium according to precise timetables, while Russia's mobilization involved transporting millions of soldiers across vast distances. Once these railway movements began, they proved almost impossible to stop, like freight trains gathering momentum on a downward grade. The inflexibility of railway-based mobilization plans contributed to turning a diplomatic crisis into a continental war. The Great War that followed demonstrated railways' terrible efficiency at industrial-scale warfare. Behind the muddy trenches of the Western Front, railways formed the logistical backbone that kept millions of men supplied with ammunition, food, and equipment. Narrow-gauge trench railways snaked through the devastated landscape, bringing shells forward to artillery batteries that consumed ammunition at rates previous generations could never have imagined. Purpose-built railway guns mounted enormous naval cannons on specially designed rail carriages, allowing them to be moved from sector to bombard enemy positions from distances of 20 miles or more. Both sides developed armored trains, bristling with guns and protected by steel plates. These mobile fortresses patrolled railway lines in contested areas, providing fire support and defending against raids. On the Eastern Front, where lines were more fluid than the Western stalemate, armored trains played significant roles in campaigns across Russia's vast spaces. The railway workshops that once built locomotives for passenger service now turned out these weapons of war. The war transformed railway operations in lasting ways. Women entered railway service in unprecedented numbers, taking positions previously closed to them as men departed for the front. Railway workers in Britain and France found themselves under military discipline, their labor deemed too essential to permit strikes or disruptions. The technical demands of moving vast quantities of war material accelerated innovations in railway organization and control. When peace finally came in 1918, railways faced the challenge of reconversion, but the lessons of wartime mobilization were not forgotten. Military planners worldwide continued to view railways as essential strategic assets. During the interwar years, the Soviet Union built railways across Siberia partly for strategic depth, while Japan expanded its network in Manchuria to support its continental ambitions. The Second World War brought railways back to the center of global conflict. Once again, they served as the essential arteries moving armies and supplies. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics relied on railways to consolidate gains after armored spearheads advanced. The Soviet Union performed the remarkable feat of evacuating entire industrial plants by rail eastward beyond the Urals, moving them beyond German reach to continue production. Railways also served grimmer purposes during this conflict, transporting populations across continents in ways that demonstrated how the same technology that had once promised human progress could be turned toward darker ends. Railway lines and junctions became priority targets for strategic bombing, as all sides recognized that severing an enemy's rail network could cripple their ability to sustain military operations. Resistance movements across occupied Europe made railways primary targets for sabotage. Derailments, destroyed bridges, and damaged locomotives became tools of underground warfare. Railway workers themselves often participated in resistance activities, using their specialized knowledge to maximum effect. The battle for railway control played out not just on front lines but in rail yards and switching stations across the continent. As the war progressed, the Allies' superior ability to move supplies by rail contributed significantly to victory. The massive build-up of men and material before the Normandy invasion required unprecedented coordination of railway movements across Britain. After the invasion, repairing and operating French and Belgian railways became crucial to maintaining the advance toward Germany. By war's end, Europe's railway infrastructure lay in ruins across vast areas. Thousands of locomotives had been destroyed, bridges blown, and tracks torn up. Yet even in devastation, railways had proven their strategic centrality. The post-war recovery would depend heavily on rebuilding these vital networks, and the lessons learned about railways' military importance would influence Cold War planning for decades to come, ensuring that the iron roads remained not just pathways of commerce and travel, but potential corridors of conflict in an uncertain future. As the smoke of war finally began to clear and the railways emerged from their decades of military service, a quiet revolution was already underway in engine sheds and maintenance yards across the world. The age of steam, for all its romance and thunder, was approaching its twilight. Engineers and railway managers had long understood that the steam locomotive, magnificent though it was, carried inherent limitations that new technologies might overcome. The seeds of this transformation had been planted surprisingly early. Even as steam locomotives were reaching their golden age in the early 20th century, alternatives were being developed in workshops and laboratories. The electric locomotive had actually preceded the internal combustion engine in railway applications, with the first successful electric railway demonstrated in Berlin in 1879 by Werner von Siemens. This small demonstration line carried passengers around a circular track, powered by electricity delivered through the rails themselves, offering a glimpse of what might be possible. Electric traction held tremendous appeal for railway operators. Unlike steam locomotives that needed to carry their fuel and water, generating power as they traveled, electric locomotives could draw energy continuously from an external source. They produced no smoke or cinders, a considerable advantage in the long tunnels that punctured mountain ranges and burrowed beneath cities. They could accelerate more quickly and maintain consistent power output without the need for stoking fires or managing water levels. The technical challenge lay in delivering electricity to moving trains. Engineers experimented with different approaches through the 1890s and early 1900s. Some systems used a third rail running alongside or between the running rails, while others employed overhead wires from which locomotives drew power through pantographs mounted on their roofs. Each system had advantages and drawbacks, suited to different circumstances and environments. The first major mainline electrification came in mountainous regions where the advantages proved most compelling. Switzerland, with its challenging alpine terrain and abundant hydroelectric power, became a pioneer in railway electrification. The Bergdorf-Thun line opened in 1899, demonstrating that electric traction could handle regular passenger service. By the 1920s, the Swiss Federal Railways had committed to wholesale electrification, a process that would eventually make Switzerland's railway network almost entirely electric. Meanwhile, the diesel engine was finding its own path to the railways. Rudolf Diesel had patented his compression ignition engine in the 1890s, but adapting it to railway use proved more complex than electrification. Early diesel engines were large, heavy, and difficult to start, making them challenging to install in locomotives. The breakthrough came with the development of the diesel-electric transmission, a hybrid approach that used a diesel engine to generate electricity, which then powered electric motors connected to the wheels. This ingenious solution combined the advantages of both technologies. The diesel engine could run at a constant, efficient speed, while the electric motors provided the variable power needed for railway operation. The locomotive could start from a standstill and accelerate smoothly without the complex mechanical transmissions that direct diesel power would require. Germany led early experiments with diesel railcars in the 1920s and 1930s. The Flying Hamburger, introduced in 1933, demonstrated the potential of diesel technology by providing fast, comfortable service between Berlin and Hamburg. This streamlined two-car unit could reach speeds of 100 miles per hour, offering journey times competitive with air travel while consuming far less fuel than steam locomotives on equivalent runs. In North America, the vast distances and abundant oil supplies made diesel traction particularly attractive. The Electromotive Corporation, which would later become the Electromotive Division of General Motors, pioneered reliable diesel-electric locomotives for American conditions. Their first major success came with streamlined passenger locomotives in the mid-1930s, followed by the revolutionary foot freight locomotive in 1939. The foot demonstrated that diesel power could handle the heavy freight traffic that formed the backbone of American railway operations. The advantages of diesel and electric traction became increasingly apparent to railway operators. These locomotives required less maintenance than their steam counterparts, which needed constant attention to boilers, fireboxes, and moving parts. They could be prepared for service in minutes rather than the hours required to raise steam. Multiple diesel or electric locomotives could be controlled by a single crew, multiplying power without additional staff. They delivered more of their fuel energy to useful work, wasting less in heat and smoke. Yet the transition from steam proceeded gradually, shaped by economics, infrastructure, and sometimes sentiment. Electrification required massive investment in power supply systems and overhead wires or third rails. Diesel locomotives represented a substantial capital outlay, though they promised lower operating costs over time. Railways that had recently invested in modern steam locomotives were understandably reluctant to scrap them prematurely. The Second World War accelerated some aspects of the transition while delaying others. Diesel locomotives proved valuable in military operations, leading to refined designs and increased production. However, the war also depleted railway finances and delayed infrastructure investment, keeping steam in service longer than might otherwise have occurred. After the war, the pace of change quickened. Britain, despite its deep heritage of steam engineering, began a modernization program in the 1950s that would eliminate steam traction within 2 decades. France electrified its main lines with remarkable speed, powered by its extensive investment in electric power generation. American railways rapidly dieselized through the 1950s, with the last major steam operations ending in the early 1960s. The experience varied across different nations and railways. Countries with abundant coal and limited oil supplies sometimes maintained steam longer. Mountain railways with established electrification could make gradual transitions. But the overall direction remained clear. By the 1970s, steam locomotives had virtually disappeared from regular service on the world's major railways, surviving primarily in industrial service in developing nations and on heritage railways maintained by enthusiasts. The last steam locomotives designed for mainline service represented the culmination of more than a century of refinement. They were sophisticated machines, incorporating advanced metallurgy, precise engineering, and elaborate systems for maximizing efficiency. Yet they could not overcome the fundamental limitations of their technology when measured against the practical advantages of diesel and electric power. As the fires were dropped for the final time in countless engine sheds around the world, an era truly ended. The transition to diesel and electric traction marked not merely a change in technology but a transformation in the very nature of railway operation, setting the stage for the high-speed rail revolution that would follow. The world of railways had transformed dramatically through the diesel and electric revolution, yet by the 1960s, a new challenge emerged. Automobiles crowded highways, aircraft crossed continents in hours, and many wondered whether railways had become relics of a bygone age. Then, on October 1, 1964, something extraordinary happened in Japan that would change perceptions forever. On that autumn morning, the first Shinkansen train departed Tokyo Station, bound for Osaka 215 miles away. The sleek, white train with its distinctive bullet-shaped nose accelerated smoothly to speeds that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The journey that once took nearly 7 hours now required just 4, with the trains gliding along at over 130 miles per hour. The Shinkansen, which became known worldwide as the bullet train, wasn't merely faster than conventional railways. It represented an entirely new approach to rail travel, built on dedicated tracks that eliminated the conflicts with slower freight trains and level crossings that had always limited speeds. The Japanese engineers had learned from both necessity and innovation. Their island nation needed efficient transportation between crowded cities, and the timing coincided with the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, which brought global attention. The Shinkansen operated with remarkable precision, with trains departing on schedules measured not in minutes but seconds. The system's safety record proved equally impressive, as decades passed without a single passenger fatality due to accident. Other nations watched with great interest. France began developing its own high-speed system during the 1970s, drawing on different technical approaches but sharing the same fundamental insight that high-speed rail required purpose-built infrastructure. The TGV, or Train à Grande Vitesse, first entered service in 1981, connecting Paris and Lyon at speeds reaching 168 miles per hour initially, with later generations pushing beyond 200 miles per hour. The French trains used electric power delivered through overhead wires, and their distinctive orange livery became an icon of modern France. The engineering challenges of high-speed rail extended far beyond simply building more powerful locomotives. The tracks themselves required exceptional precision, with curves calculated carefully to prevent excessive forces that would make passengers uncomfortable or compromise safety. Bridges and tunnels needed special design considerations, as trains moving at high speeds created pressure waves and aerodynamic effects unknown in conventional railway operation. Even the overhead electrical systems demanded innovation, as the pantographs collecting power from the wires had to maintain contact while moving at tremendous speeds. Germany developed its own approach with the Intercity Express, or ICE, which began service in 1991. The German system emphasized integration with existing railway networks, allowing high-speed trains to share some conventional tracks in urban areas while using dedicated high-speed lines between cities. This flexibility meant that passengers could travel from city center to city center without changing trains, maintaining railway's traditional advantage over airports located on city outskirts. Spain embraced high-speed rail with particular enthusiasm, constructing an extensive network of AVE lines that connected Madrid with cities across the country. The Spanish system chose the same track gauge as other European high-speed networks, a fascinating reversal given that Spain's conventional railways had historically used a different, wider gauge than most of Europe. These new high-speed lines physically demonstrated Spain's integration with broader European transport networks. Across Asia, other nations followed Japan's pioneering example. South Korea introduced its KTX system, Taiwan built a high-speed line connecting its major cities, and China embarked on perhaps the most ambitious high-speed rail construction program ever undertaken. Within just 2 decades, China built tens of thousands of miles of high-speed track, creating a network that exceeded all other nations combined. Trains like the Fuxinghao now cruise at 217 miles per hour on routes connecting megacities that house millions of people. Engineers also explored alternative technologies that pushed beyond conventional steel wheels on steel rails. The principle of magnetic levitation, or maglev, used powerful magnets to suspend trains above guideways, eliminating friction and allowing even higher speeds. Japan constructed an experimental maglev line where trains exceeded 360 miles per hour during test runs, though the technology's high costs limited widespread adoption. A short commercial maglev line in Shanghai, opened in 2004, demonstrated the concept's viability by reaching operational speeds of 268 miles per hour, even though its brief route meant the train rarely sustained maximum velocity. Other innovations focused on adapting high-speed trains to existing infrastructure. Tilting trains, pioneered in various countries, used mechanisms that leaned into curves much as motorcyclists do, allowing higher speeds on winding routes without requiring completely new track alignments. Italy's Pendolino trains became perhaps the most recognized tilting design, operating across Europe on routes where geography made conventional high-speed lines impractical. The modern era also brought sophisticated technology into railway operations. Computer systems manage traffic flow, optimizing schedules and routing trains through complex networks. GPS and advanced signaling allowed closer spacing between trains while maintaining safety margins. Inside carriages, passengers found amenities that earlier travelers could scarcely have imagined, from wireless internet to electrical outlets at every seat, transforming travel time into productive or leisure time rather than merely passage. Yet challenges remained. Building high-speed rail required substantial investment, and not every route could justify the expense. North America, despite pioneering railways in the 19th century, lagged behind in high-speed development, with only a few corridors offering services that approached speeds common in Europe or Asia. Debates continued about whether investment should focus on high-speed rail or other transport priorities, reflecting different geographic, economic, and political circumstances. Environmental considerations increasingly influenced railway development. Modern electric trains produce no direct emissions, and even when accounting for power generation, they typically consumed far less energy per passenger mile than automobiles or aircraft. As concerns about climate change intensified, railways found themselves positioned as sustainable transport options for the future, particularly for journeys of a few hundred miles where their door-to-door times competed favorably with flying. The experience of railway travel had evolved remarkably from the sooty, jolting journeys of the steam age. Modern trains glided so smoothly that passengers could balance coins on edge or work on laptop computers without disturbance. The landscape streamed past windows at speeds that would have terrified Victorian travelers, yet the motion felt gentle and calm. Quiet interiors, climate control, and comfortable seating made the journey itself pleasant rather than something merely to be endured. As railways entered their third century, they had reinvented themselves repeatedly, proving more adaptable than skeptics imagined. The high-speed revolution demonstrated that even in an age of jet aircraft and autonomous vehicles, steel wheels on steel rails retained advantages worth preserving and advancing. The story of railways continued to unfold, connecting cities and continents, carrying millions of passengers through landscapes that the earliest railway pioneers could never have imagined their iron roads would traverse. The transformation that railways brought to human civilization ripples through every aspect of our modern world, often in ways we no longer consciously recognize. As we rest here in the quiet of evening, it's worth contemplating how those iron tracks and steam engines that emerged 2 centuries ago fundamentally altered the course of human history, changing not just how we move, but how we think, how we organize our societies, and how we perceive time and space itself. When the first railways connected distant towns in the 1820s and 1830s, they did more than provide a faster alternative to horse-drawn coaches. They collapsed distances that had remained fixed throughout all of human history. A journey that might have taken a week by stagecoach suddenly required only a few hours. This compression of space and time proved so profound that many early passengers reported feelings of disorientation, as if the very fabric of reality had been altered. And in a sense, it had. The railway created what we might call a new geography, where proximity was measured not in miles but in hours, where cities hundreds of miles apart became closer in practical terms than villages that had once been a hard day's walk from each other. The impact on urban development remains visible in every major city today. Railway stations became the anchors around which metropolises organized themselves. Districts grew up around termini, their character shaped by whether they served industrial freight or fashionable passengers. The suburbs themselves, those residential communities that ring every modern city, owe their existence largely to railways. For the first time in history, people could live at some distance from their workplace, commuting daily on trains that ran to reliable schedules. This separation of home and work, now so fundamental to modern life that we barely question it, was largely a creation of the railway age. Industries transformed themselves to match the railway's rhythm. Factories no longer needed to cluster around ports or navigable waterways, but could locate wherever rail connections made economic sense. Raw materials could arrive from distant sources, manufactured goods could reach markets hundreds of miles away. The predictability and capacity of rail freight meant that businesses could plan on scales previously impossible, coordinating production and distribution across entire continents. The modern economy, with its complex supply chains and just-in-time delivery, traces its ancestry directly to those first freight trains hauling coal and cotton. Perhaps even more profound was the railway's cultural impact. Before trains, most people lived and died within a small radius of their birthplace. The world beyond the horizon remained largely abstract, known only through stories and travelers' tales. Railways democratized movement, making travel accessible not just to the wealthy but to ordinary working people. For the price of a third-class ticket, a factory worker could visit the seaside, a farmer could see the capital city, a young person from a village could seek opportunity in distant towns. This mobility mixed populations that had remained separate for generations, exposing people to different accents, customs, and ways of thinking. The railway carriage became a uniquely democratic space where different social classes shared the same journey, if not always the same comfort. The cultural exchanges enabled by railways flowed in all directions. Ideas spread along the tracks as readily as goods and people. Newspapers printed in major cities reached provincial towns on morning trains, creating a more unified national conversation. Touring theatre companies, musicians, and lecturers could reach audiences across entire countries. Regional cuisines, architectural styles, and fashion spread and blended. In this sense, railways didn't just shrink physical distances, they also narrowed cultural ones, helping to forge national identities while simultaneously making those nations more diverse and cosmopolitan. The railway's influence on how we structure time remains fundamental to modern life. Before railways, each town kept its own local time, adjusted to the sun's position. This variation posed no problem when journeys took days and schedules were approximate. But when trains needed to coordinate arrivals and departures across hundreds of miles, standardization became essential. Railway companies pioneered the adoption of uniform time zones, a system so practical that it eventually became universal. The very concept of living by the clock, of coordinating our activities to minutes rather than hours or the position of the sun, spread outward from railway timetables to organize all of industrial society. Today, in an era of automobiles and airplanes, it's easy to view railways as somewhat old-fashioned, a technology past its prime. Yet in many ways, railways are experiencing a renaissance. As concerns about climate change and sustainable transportation grow more urgent, the efficiency of moving people and goods by rail becomes increasingly relevant. A train can transport hundreds of passengers or tons of freight while producing far less carbon emissions per mile than cars or trucks. High-speed rail networks in Europe and Asia demonstrate that trains can compete effectively with short-haul flights while offering a more pleasant and sustainable travel experience. Modern railways continue to evolve and innovate. Computer systems manage traffic flows with a precision impossible in a steam era, allowing more trains to operate safely on existing tracks. New materials and designs create lighter, more efficient rolling stock. Some railways are pioneering the use of hydrogen fuel cells and battery power, seeking to eliminate emissions entirely while retaining the fundamental advantages of steel wheels on steel rails. The basic concept that Richard Trevithick demonstrated in 1804 remains sound. Guided transport on dedicated tracks offers unique benefits of efficiency, capacity, and reliability that no amount of technological progress has managed to obsolete. In developing regions, railways continue their historic role of opening opportunities and connecting isolated communities. New rail lines in Africa, Asia, and South America bring the same transformative effects they brought to Europe and North America in the 19th century, linking agricultural regions to markets, enabling resource development, and giving rural populations access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities in urban centers. As we drift towards sleep, we might reflect on how the railway's legacy surrounds us in ways both obvious and subtle. The cities we live in, shaped by railway geography. The weekend journeys and daily commutes that railways made conceivable. The industrial economy that railways enabled. The standardized time by which we organize our days. The very notion that distance can be overcome, that we might live mobile rather than rooted lives, owes much to those early pioneers who believed steam and iron could remake the world. The story of railways is ultimately a human story, one of ambition and ingenuity, of back-breaking labor and visionary engineering, of risks taken and frontiers crossed. It reminds us that technology shapes society, but that humans remain the authors of that technology, deciding where to lay the tracks and what destinations to seek. As the railway era passes 2 centuries, its journey continues, adapting to new challenges while carrying forward that essential purpose, bringing people together, moving what needs moving, and connecting the world across iron roads that still stretch toward distant horizons. As we bring to a close our journey through the remarkable story of railways, from the first steam engines to the iron tracks that connected distant lands and transformed our world, we hope these tales of innovation and adventure have gently carried you through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration of how trains brought people together and made our vast world feel just a little smaller. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help other smart sleepers find their way here. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.